Deep in Nigeria, the Avengers receive intelligence suggesting that Crossbones may be preparing an attack. Hidden on the outskirts of the area, the team waits for the right moment to move while monitoring suspicious activity. During surveillance, Captain America notices a garbage truck behaving strangely and asks Falcon to send a drone for a closer inspection. As the drone scans beneath the vehicle, Sam activates its X-ray system and immediately spots a problem. Not only is the driver carrying weapons, but the truck is also significantly heavier than it should be. The excessive weight suggests it is being used for more than transportation. It is intended to smash through obstacles. Moments later, the truck approaches a military facility. Without hesitation, the driver jumps out while the vehicle continues forward, crashing through the security barricade. The impact clears a path for a squad of armed criminals rushing behind it. The intruders quickly release sleeping gas, rendering everyone in the area unconscious before storming inside. Their target is a laboratory located at the top of the building. Once there, they steal a container holding a dangerous chemical agent. However, before they can escape unnoticed, the Avengers arrive on the scene. The heroes immediately engage the armed guards outside, rapidly overpowering them. With the exterior secured, Captain America heads toward the laboratory and asks Wanda to use her abilities to clear the sleeping gas from the area. Unfortunately, by the time he reaches the upper level, Crossbones has already escaped the building. Meanwhile, Black Widow races after the fleeing criminals on a motorcycle. During the pursuit, one of the villains manages to trap her, hurling her into an armored vehicle and tossing a grenade in after her. Forced to react instantly, Natasha uses one of the criminals as protection from the blast and survives the attack. Realizing the Avengers are closing in, Crossbones hands the stolen vial to one of his men and orders his team to separate. If they scatter, their chances of escape increase dramatically. Not far away, a crowded fair is taking place. The criminals discard their tactical gear and disappear into the sea of civilians, forcing the Avengers to search through the massive crowd. As Captain America moves through the area, he is suddenly struck by an adhesive explosive that sticks directly to his shield. Knowing the blast could injure nearby civilians, Steve quickly throws the vibranium shield high into the air before the device detonates. Immediately afterward, Crossbones emerges from the crowd and launches a brutal attack. The two clash in the middle of the busy fairground, with Crossbones landing several heavy blows during the fight. Elsewhere, Natasha tracks down another member of the group. Even while outnumbered, she effortlessly handles two attackers at the same time. Her superior combat skills allow her to gain the upper hand and defeat both men. Desperate, one of the criminals grabs the biological weapon and threatens to release it unless she drops her firearm. Before Natasha can respond, Falcon's drone swoops in and strikes the man, knocking him unconscious. The vial slips from his hands, but Natasha reacts quickly and catches it before it can hit the ground in the middle of the crowded event. Back at the main fight, Captain America gradually gains control and finally knocks Crossbones to the ground. With the villain defeated, Steve demands to know who hired him. Crossbones answers with a shocking name: Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier. The moment he reveals the information, Crossbones activates explosives attached to himself, intending to kill both Steve and everyone nearby. Wanda reacts instantly, using her powers to contain the blast and lift him into the air. She succeeds in moving him away from the crowd, but the explosion sends him crashing into a nearby building, which is completely devastated by the force of the detonation. Sometime later, far from the destruction, Tony Stark stands before a group of university students delivering a presentation about innovation and technology. At the end of the event, he surprises everyone by announcing that he will personally fund their project. After the presentation, Tony leaves the building and heads toward an elevator. There, a woman approaches him carrying a photograph of her son. The encounter quickly turns uncomfortable. She explains that her son died in Sokovia during the battle against Ultron. According to her, Tony's actions led to his death. Holding up the photograph, she tells Stark that she does not see him as a hero. In her eyes, he is responsible for what happened. The conversation leaves Tony visibly shaken. Later at Avengers headquarters, Stark arrives alongside Secretary of State Thaddeus Ross, formerly known as General Ross. With the entire team gathered, Ross addresses the Avengers and delivers troubling news. He argues that for years the group has operated without oversight, crossing borders and engaging in conflicts whenever they believed it was necessary. According to him, world governments are no longer willing to allow such unchecked authority. Ross reveals that representatives from 117 nations have approved a new agreement known as the Sokovia Accords. Under this arrangement, the Avengers would no longer act independently. Instead, any future missions would require authorization from the United Nations. Steve Rogers immediately voices his concerns. Ross then shifts attention to two absent members of the team, Thor and Bruce Banner. He points out that both individuals possess power comparable to weapons of mass destruction and that nobody even knows where they are. In his view, allowing such power to remain unsupervised is unacceptable. Finally, Ross announces that the United Nations will soon meet in Vienna to formally ratify the agreement. If the Avengers refuse to cooperate, they will be prohibited from operating altogether. Once Ross leaves, the team begins arguing over what to do. Steve becomes the leading voice against government control, believing that outside authorities could prevent the Avengers from acting when people need help most. Others see the situation differently. As the debate continues, Tony pulls out the photograph given to him earlier. He tells the team about the young man in the picture. The victim had earned a degree in computer engineering and had recently been hired by Intel because of his hard work and talent. Before beginning his career, however, he decided to spend a summer in Sokovia helping build homes for struggling families. Tony explains that the young man had an entire future ahead of him. Yet that future vanished when a building collapsed during the battle with Ultron. The tragedy weighs heavily on Stark. He argues that the Avengers cannot keep acting without accountability. If they refuse to accept responsibility for the consequences of their actions, then they are no better than the people they fight against. While tensions continue rising within the team, Steve receives a message that changes everything. Peggy Carter has passed away. Without hesitation, he puts the debate aside and travels to attend her funeral. After the ceremony, Natasha finds Steve and speaks with him privately. She reveals that several members of the Avengers have already agreed to sign the Sokovia Accords, including herself. She explains that she is heading to Vienna to officially support the agreement. After sharing a brief farewell with her longtime friend, Natasha leaves for Austria, while Steve remains behind, uncertain about what comes next. In Vienna, Natasha Romanoff arrives at the international conference, where she meets Prince T'Challa of Wakanda. The two exchange a few words before taking their places for the historic gathering. As the meeting begins, King T'Chaka steps forward to address the audience. During his speech, he expresses gratitude for the efforts being made toward international cooperation and pledges Wakanda's support for the new agreement. Everything appears calm until T'Challa notices unusual movement outside the building. Sensing danger, he immediately shouts for everyone to get down. Unfortunately, the warning comes too late. A massive explosion tears through the area, sending debris flying in every direction. Amid the chaos, King T'Chaka is fatally wounded. Across the Atlantic, Steve Rogers watches coverage of the attack and is stunned when authorities identify Bucky Barnes as the prime suspect behind the bombing. Back in Vienna, Natasha approaches the grieving prince. T'Challa, now carrying the weight of his father's death, vows that he will personally hunt down the Winter Soldier and make him pay. Following leads on Bucky's whereabouts, Steve eventually locates an apartment where his old friend is hiding. Hoping to get answers before anyone else reaches him, he enters the building and confronts Barnes directly. The conversation is brief. Bucky insists that he had nothing to do with the bombing. He tells Steve that he left that life behind and no longer carries out missions like the one in Vienna. Before they can continue, several explosive devices crash through the windows. Moments later, armed officers storm the apartment. Without hesitation, Steve moves to protect Bucky from the assault. The situation rapidly spirals into a battle as heavily trained soldiers attempt to capture Barnes. Despite their numbers, they prove completely unprepared for the Winter Soldier. Bucky tears through the attackers, knocking them aside and clearing a path to escape. Racing up the stairwell, he eventually reaches the rooftop. Waiting for him, there is a new threat. The Black Panther launches himself into the fight. Consumed by the desire for revenge, T'Challa attacks relentlessly. Bucky has no interest in standing his ground and focuses entirely on escaping, dodging the Wakandan warrior's strikes before continuing his retreat. Soon the chase spills into the crowded streets below. Now Bucky finds himself pursued by Captain America, Black Panther, and law enforcement all at the same time. Determined not to lose him, Steve hijacks a police vehicle and races after his friend. Black Panther quickly notices and leaps onto the moving car, using it to continue the pursuit. Realizing he needs more speed, Bucky steals a motorcycle and accelerates through traffic. T'Challa immediately follows. The two engage in a brutal struggle while moving at high speed. At one point, the Black Panther nearly forces Bucky off the motorcycle, even grabbing hold of his vibranium arm. Barnes barely manages to recover before throwing T'Challa backward. To slow everyone down, Bucky detonates a grenade inside a tunnel, collapsing part of the structure behind him. even that isn't enough. T'Challa continues the pursuit and eventually catches up again, coming within seconds of killing the Winter Soldier. Just before he can strike the final blow, Captain America intervenes and stops him. The chase finally comes to an end when authorities flood the area. War Machine arrives shortly afterward, helping secure the situation and placing Steve, Bucky, and T'Challa under arrest. Later, at the Austrian Joint Counterterrorist Center, a psychiatrist arrives to evaluate Bucky Barnes. As the questioning begins, events elsewhere are already being set into motion. A delivery worker drops off a package at a local power facility. The moment confirmation of delivery is received, the supposed psychiatrist activates a hidden device. An explosion erupts inside the power station. Within seconds, electricity across the city is knocked offline. The sudden blackout creates confusion throughout the facility. Officers rush toward Bucky's holding area while Steve follows close behind. Inside the interrogation room, the psychiatrist reveals his true intentions. Rather than questioning Barnes, he begins reciting words from a familiar red notebook, the same trigger phrases once used by Hydra to control the Winter Soldier. The programming immediately takes effect. As Steve races toward the room, Bucky transforms into the deadly operative he once was. When Rogers finally reaches the area, he is caught completely off guard. The brainwashed Winter Soldier attacks him and sends him crashing into an elevator shaft. While Steve struggles to climb back out, Tony Stark attempts to confront Barnes. Without his armor, however, he stands little chance and is quickly overpowered. That leaves T'Challa to continue the fight. Even without access to advanced Wakandan technology, the Black Panther proves to be an exceptional warrior. He battles the Winter Soldier head-on and eventually knocks him from a height of nearly 3 stories. But when T'Challa reaches the ground below, Barnes has already vanished. High above the chaos, Bucky makes his way toward a helicopter parked on a rooftop landing platform. Just as he prepares to escape, Captain America arrives. In one of the most incredible displays of strength ever seen from Steve Rogers, he grabs the departing helicopter with his bare hands and refuses to let it take off. Unable to break free, Bucky loses control and sends the aircraft crashing toward Steve. The collision forces both men into another confrontation. Barnes grabs Rogers and the two plunge into a nearby canal. Despite everything that has happened, Steve still refuses to abandon his friend. He rescues Bucky from the water and carries him to safety after the Winter Soldier loses consciousness. Meanwhile, the fake psychiatrist quietly watches reports of the escape. His plan proceeding exactly as intended, he boards a flight bound for Moscow. Sometime later, Bucky regains consciousness. With the mind control broken, Steve begins asking questions about the mysterious man responsible for the attack. Barnes reveals the truth. The imposter is Baron Zemo. According to Bucky, Zemo is searching for information connected to a mission from 1991. During that operation, the Winter Soldier forced a vehicle off the road, caused it to crash, and stole a shipment containing a powerful super soldier serum. Believing Zemo intends to use the serum to create or control enhanced individuals, Steve suggests bringing Tony into the investigation. Sam Wilson disagrees. He points out that the authorities already consider them fugitives and argues that they can no longer trust the system. From now on, he believes they should handle things themselves. Elsewhere, Tony is engaged in a heated discussion with Secretary Ross. Frustrated by Steve's actions, Stark admits that he now views Captain America as a criminal. He even declares that if necessary, he will stop him by force. Still, Tony asks for one final opportunity to resolve the situation peacefully and requests a single day to track Steve down himself. Looking for additional support, Stark travels to Queens, New York. There, he pays a visit to a teenager named Peter Parker. Tony surprises the young student by showing footage of a masked vigilante swinging through the city and stopping criminals. Although Peter initially tries to play innocent, he eventually admits the obvious truth. He is Spider-Man. Recognizing the young hero's potential, Tony offers him a place on his team. To help prepare him for what lies ahead, Stark upgrades Peter's suit and provides improvements to his web shooting equipment, bringing the young crime fighter into a conflict far bigger than anything he has faced before. Back at the Avengers compound, a sudden explosion is detected somewhere nearby. Believing it could be a threat, Vision leaves to investigate the disturbance. The moment he is gone, Clint Barton quietly appears and calls out to Wanda. He tells her that the time has finally come and urges her to leave with him. Before they can make their escape, Vision unexpectedly returns. Using his ability to phase through solid objects, he effortlessly slips through Hawkeye's arrows and disarms him by taking away his bow. Even without his signature weapon, Clint refuses to back down and continues fighting. Unfortunately for him, Vision's superior abilities give him a clear advantage. Seeing Hawkeye struggling, Wanda steps in. She unleashes her powers on Vision, locking him in place and forcing him downward through multiple levels of the facility. The android crashes several floors below, temporarily removed from the situation. With Vision out of the way, Clint tells Wanda they cannot waste any more time. Together, they leave the compound and head off with Scott Lang to meet Captain America. Once reunited, the group begins planning its next move. Their discussion is interrupted when an alarm suddenly sounds throughout the area. Bucky immediately realizes what it means. The nearby airport is being evacuated, which can only mean one thing: Tony Stark and his team have arrived. Hoping to avoid another fight, Steve approaches Iron Man and attempts to explain everything. He tells Tony that the psychiatrist responsible for interrogating Bucky was actually behind the entire conspiracy. Tony isn't convinced. Instead, he orders Spider-Man to take Captain America's shield. Frustrated that words are getting nowhere, Stark insists that he still wants to keep the Avengers united. He asks Steve to surrender peacefully and end the conflict before it gets worse. Steve refuses. At that moment, he signals Scott Lang. Instantly, Ant-Man activates his suit, enlarges himself, and catches everyone off guard. He kicks Spider-Man away before returning Steve's shield to him. As the battle lines form, Tony notices Wanda and Clint heading toward the hangar and immediately moves to intercept them. Meanwhile, Rhodey spots Bucky and Falcon heading in the opposite direction. Black Panther joins the pursuit, determined to stop Barnes, but Captain America steps directly into his path and forces him to deal with him first. Spider-Man catches up to Falcon and Bucky and throws himself into the fight with incredible enthusiasm. He manages to knock Sam Wilson off balance and even blocks a powerful strike from the Winter Soldier. While Peter keeps Falcon occupied, War Machine and Black Panther engage Captain America. Steve skillfully uses his shield to defend himself against both opponents at once, refusing to let them slow him down. Elsewhere, Hawkeye confronts Iron Man. Clint fires a specialized magnetic arrow that suddenly pulls dozens of parked vehicles toward Tony. The cars slam together around Iron Man, temporarily trapping him beneath the metal pileup. At the terminal, Spider-Man finally gains the upper hand against Falcon. Using his webs, he tangles both himself and Sam together in an attempt to stop the fight. Falcon quickly adapts. One of his drones strikes Peter and drags him away, freeing Sam from the trap. Nearby, after being knocked aside by Black Widow, Ant-Man rushes over to Captain America and hands him what appears to be a tiny toy truck. Steve throws it. The miniature vehicle instantly expands into a full-size truck and explodes near their opponents, creating a massive distraction. Taking advantage of the confusion, Captain America regroups with his allies and charges toward the hangar. Before they can reach it, Vision and the remaining heroes arrive to block their path. The standoff lasts only seconds. Then both teams rush forward, and the airport erupts into a full-scale superhero battle. Powerful attacks fly in every direction as heroes clash across the runway. Among everyone involved, Wanda proves to be one of the most dangerous combatants. Her abilities allow her to overwhelm multiple opponents, sending both Natasha and T'Challa crashing aside with little effort. Elsewhere, Spider-Man manages to bring Captain America down by targeting his legs and using his agility to keep Steve off balance. However, experience ultimately wins out. Steve quickly adjusts to Peter's fighting style and gains control of the encounter. Wanting to remove him from the fight without hurting him, Rogers drops a massive airport walkway structure toward him. Spider-Man is forced to hold the collapsing weight in place, allowing Steve to continue moving. At the same time, Hawkeye fires an arrow directly at Iron Man. The projectile carries Ant-Man, who is shrunk to microscopic size. Scott enters Tony's armor and begins tampering with its internal systems from the inside. In response, Stark activates the suit's fire suppression system, blasting Ant-Man back out before he can do any serious damage. Realizing they are running out of time, Falcon reveals the real objective. He tells Captain America and Bucky that the rest of the team will keep everyone occupied while the two of them reach the jet and confront the true enemy behind everything. To buy them that opportunity, Ant-Man uses the Pym particles in a new way. He grows into a gigantic version of himself. Now towering over the airport, Giant Man begins attacking everything around him, drawing the attention of every hero present. While the others focus on the giant threat, Steve and Bucky race toward the hangar. From above, Vision notices their escape attempt. He phases through Giant Man's body and fires a powerful attack at the hangar entrance, causing part of the structure to collapse. Wanda reacts immediately. Using her powers, she holds the falling debris in place and prevents it from crushing her teammates. Seeing her occupied, War Machine launches a sonic attack that disrupts her concentration and knocks her out of the fight. For a moment, it appears the rubble will come crashing down on Steve and Bucky, but they manage to escape and continue toward the aircraft. Just outside the jet, Black Widow intercepts them. She asks Steve one final time if he is truly determined to continue. When he confirms that he is, Natasha makes her choice. Instead of stopping him, she turns and attacks T'Challa, giving Captain America and Bucky the opening they need to escape. Back at the center of the battlefield, Spider-Man finally figures out a way to bring Giant Man down. Using his webs, he binds Scott's legs together. The enormous hero loses his balance and crashes to the ground. To end the fight, Iron Man and War Machine fly in together and strike Giant Man with a combined attack, knocking him unconscious. The giant collapses, nearly landing on top of Spider-Man. With the battle effectively over, Tony approaches Peter and thanks him for his help. He then orders the young hero to return home, believing he has done more than enough. Immediately afterward, Stark launches into the air and heads after Steve and Bucky's jet. War Machine joins the pursuit. Falcon moves to stop them and engages Rhodey in the sky. War Machine calls for Vision's assistance. Vision fires an energy beam, intending to hit Falcon. The shot misses. Instead, it strikes War Machine's arc-powered flight system. Rhodey's suit instantly loses power. Horrified, Tony and Sam abandon their pursuit and dive after him. Neither reaches him in time. War Machine plummets to the ground and crashes, leaving him severely injured and unconscious. Later, at the hospital, Tony speaks privately with Vision about the accident. During their conversation, Friday interrupts with an urgent transmission from the Berlin authorities. As Tony flies away in a helicopter, Friday explains the discovery. Records show that officials requested a psychiatrist to evaluate Bucky after his arrest. However, the man who conducted the interrogation was not the real doctor at all. The investigation reveals that the genuine psychiatrist was found dead in his apartment. Even more disturbing, authorities discovered a facial disguise designed to make someone resemble Bucky Barnes. The evidence points directly to one person, Baron Zemo. Meanwhile, completely unaware that his cover has been exposed, Zemo arrives at a remote Hydra facility hidden deep within Siberia. Inside the bunker, he discovers 5 additional Winter Soldiers preserved in cryogenic chambers. Elsewhere, Tony makes an unexpected stop at the Raft, a maximum security prison located in the middle of the ocean and operated under Ross's authority. There, Stark explains everything he has learned about Zemo and the deception surrounding Bucky. Ross refuses to listen. The secretary dismisses Tony's concerns and makes it clear that he no longer trusts him. With the government unwilling to help and time running out, Tony realizes he may have no choice but to handle the situation himself. Back at the Raft, Tony Stark heads toward the cells where the captured Avengers are being held. Before speaking with anyone, he quietly disables the prison's audio monitoring system to ensure their conversation remains private. Once the surveillance is cut off, Tony approaches Sam Wilson and reveals that he has uncovered the truth behind everything. He explains that Baron Zemo manipulated the entire situation and framed Bucky from the beginning. Knowing time is running out, Stark asks Sam for Steve Rogers' location. Realizing Tony is finally on the right side of the investigation, Sam gives him the information he needs. Without wasting another second, Tony returns to his helicopter and orders it toward the mainland. Halfway through the journey, however, he decides not to wait. Stark activates his armor, launches himself out of the aircraft, and flies the rest of the distance toward Siberia under his own power. What Tony doesn't realize is that someone else is following him. Hidden from sight, T'Challa trails behind, determined to see this conflict through to the end. Meanwhile, Captain America and Bucky arrive at the remote Hydra bunker hidden deep within the frozen wilderness. Entering the facility, they cautiously move through the corridors in search of Baron Zemo. The deeper they go, the more uneasy the atmosphere becomes. At one point, they hear footsteps approaching and immediately prepare for another confrontation. Their suspicion only grows when they discover the newcomer is Iron Man. Fortunately, this time Tony isn't there to fight. Now aware of Zemo's deception, he tells Steve and Bucky that they can stand down. He admits that he finally understands the truth and has come to help stop the real enemy. For the first time in a long while, the 3 former teammates find themselves working together. Their search eventually leads them into a large underground chamber containing the cryogenic pods of the other Winter Soldiers. But something is wrong. As they approach the capsules, they discover every super soldier inside is already dead. Before anyone can react, Zemo's voice echoes through the room. The mastermind calmly steps forward and admits that he has spent an entire year studying the Avengers, learning exactly how they think and how they operate. Steve asks whether all of this was revenge for Sokovia. Zemo immediately rejects the idea. Captain America then asks if he lost someone during the tragedy. The answer is simple and devastating. Zemo reveals that everyone he cared about was taken from him. His family, his future, and his entire world disappeared during the destruction. He then tells them that before long, they will understand exactly how that feels. Walking toward a nearby monitor, Zemo explains that powerful organizations are rarely defeated by outside enemies. Instead, they destroy themselves from within. With those words, he activates a hidden recording. Security footage from a mission in 1991 begins playing on the screen. The room falls silent. Tony watches in horror as the footage reveals the Winter Soldier forcing a car off the road and crashing it into a tree. Inside that vehicle are Howard and Maria Stark. The recording shows Bucky carrying out the assassination before taking the case containing the super soldier serum. The truth hits Tony like a hammer. The man who murdered his parents is standing only a few feet away. Unable to process what he has just seen, Tony turns toward Steve and asks a single question. "Did you know?" After a brief pause, Steve admits that he did. The answer shatters whatever trust remained. Feeling completely betrayed, Tony lashes out and strikes Captain America before turning his full attention toward Bucky. While chaos erupts behind him, Zemo quietly slips away. Consumed by grief and rage, Iron Man attacks with everything he has. His armor gives him a massive advantage, allowing him to overpower Bucky and nearly tear off his cybernetic arm. Steve intervenes just in time, throwing his shield between them and forcing Tony to redirect his attack. The fight escalates rapidly. Powerful blows shake the structure, and entire sections of the bunker begin collapsing around them. As debris crashes from above, Steve realizes they may not survive if they stay together. He orders Bucky to escape while he remains behind to hold off Tony. Reluctantly, Bucky obeys. While Rogers keeps Iron Man occupied, he manages to damage one of Tony's propulsion systems, slowing him down temporarily. Even so, Stark refuses to stop. He breaks away and continues pursuing Barnes through the bunker. Several times, Tony comes dangerously close to ending the fight for good. Each time, Steve arrives at the last possible moment to stop him. Eventually, Bucky reaches the route leading out of the facility. Before he can escape, Tony fires a missile that destroys the hatch controls and seals the passage shut. The exit is gone. Now trapped, Bucky finds himself face to face with an enraged Iron Man. Tony grabs him and begins overpowering him once again. Before he can finish the job, Captain America launches himself into the fight, knocking both men to the ground. Steve continues trying to reason with Tony. He admits that nothing can undo what happened to Howard and Maria Stark, but Tony no longer cares about explanations. At this point, revenge is all that matters. Outnumbered, Iron Man is gradually forced backward. Bucky sees an opening and attempts to disable the armor by removing Tony's arc reactor. The plan nearly works. In response, Stark unleashes an energy blast at point-blank range. The attack is so powerful that it completely destroys Bucky's vibranium arm. With Barnes helpless and severely weakened, Steve throws himself back into the battle. While the conflict rages underground, another confrontation is unfolding above. Standing on the frozen surface outside the bunker, Zemo listens repeatedly to the last voicemail message left by his wife. The recording plays over and over again as he reflects on everything he has lost. That is when T'Challa finally approaches him. The Wakandan king asks why he went to such extreme lengths to turn the Avengers against one another. Zemo answers honestly. He explains that his father lived in a remote region of Sokovia. During Ultron's attack, his wife and children sought shelter there, believing they would be safe. For a brief moment, Zemo remembers feeling hopeful as he watched Iron Man and the Avengers fighting to save the city. Then the city fell. When the destruction finally ended, it took him 2 days to locate the bodies of his family. That loss changed everything. Knowing he could never defeat the Avengers through strength alone, Zemo chose a different path. He would make them destroy each other. Looking back at the bunker below, he points out that his plan has succeeded perfectly. T'Challa listens carefully. After everything he has experienced, he realizes that revenge has consumed far too many lives already. Refusing to allow another tragedy, he stops Zemo just as the man attempts to take his own life. Back inside the bunker, the final battle reaches its climax. Using the combat data stored within his systems, Iron Man analyzes Captain America's fighting style and begins predicting his movements. The strategy works. Tony disarms Steve and launches a devastating counterattack. Exhausted and battered, Captain America struggles to stay on his feet. At one point, Steve tells Tony that Bucky is his friend. Tony responds with a painful reminder. "He was my friend too." The words are followed by a powerful punch that nearly ends the fight. Still, Steve refuses to quit. Summoning the last of his strength, he continues attacking. Using both skill and determination, he repeatedly strikes Iron Man with the vibranium shield until the arc reactor powering the armor is finally destroyed. The suit shuts down. The fight is over. Tony lies defeated while Steve slowly picks up his shield and helps Bucky stand. Watching them prepare to leave, Tony reminds Steve that Howard Stark designed that shield. In his eyes, Steve no longer deserves to carry it. After a long pause, Captain America silently drops the shield and walks away. Some time later, Tony returns to the Avengers compound. There, he receives a package waiting for him. Inside is a letter from Steve Rogers. In the message, Steve apologizes for keeping the truth about Tony's parents hidden for so long. He acknowledges the pain his silence caused and expresses regret for the choices he made. Alongside the letter is a phone number. Steve writes that no matter what has happened between them, Tony only needs to call if he ever requires help. As Stark finishes reading the note, another call comes in. This time, it is Secretary Ross. Ross reports that a prison break has taken place at the raft. Captain America and the Winter Soldier have successfully rescued the imprisoned Avengers. Meanwhile, after the rescue mission is completed, Bucky travels to Wakanda. Understanding that fragments of Hydra's programming may still remain inside his mind, he requests to be placed back into cryogenic sleep until a permanent solution can be found. The Wakandans agree. Bucky willingly enters the chamber and is frozen once more, choosing to remain asleep until his mind can finally be freed from Hydra's control forever. Later, Steve speaks privately with T'Challa. He warns the Wakandan king that if the United Nations discovers Bucky's location, they will undoubtedly come searching for him. T'Challa remains completely unfazed. Now wiser than before and no longer driven by revenge, he calmly responds that he welcomes the challenge. If anyone decides to come after them, he is more than ready to see them try. One thing that struck me while watching Captain America: Civil War is how unusual this trilogy became over time. If you go back to the first Captain America film, it feels almost modest by comparison. It was a straightforward origin story, charming, enjoyable, and honestly, a lot more old-fashioned than people sometimes remember. It introduced Steve Rogers as the guy willing to jump on a grenade before he had any powers, and that simple idea carried the entire movie. Then the Winter Soldier came along and completely changed the conversation. That was the moment when the Captain America series stopped feeling like just another superhero franchise and started carving out its own identity. The action felt sharper, the stakes felt more personal. There was a darker edge to everything without losing the sense of fun that made Marvel movies work in the first place. For a lot of fans, myself included, The Winter Soldier became the benchmark not just for Captain America films, but for the MCU as a whole, which brings us to Civil War. And honestly, that's a tough movie to evaluate because it's following a film that many people consider one of Marvel's best. What I found interesting is that Civil War doesn't really try to outdo The Winter Soldier by simply going bigger. I mean, technically it does go bigger. The cast is larger, the conflict is larger, the scale is larger. But the movie seems more interested in expanding the world around Steve Rogers than trying to recreate what made the previous film successful. For me, it lands somewhere between the first two movies. I don't think it reaches the consistency of The Winter Soldier. That film had a focus and momentum that was hard to beat. Every scene felt like it was pushing toward something. Civil War, by comparison, occasionally feels pulled in several directions at once. That's almost unavoidable when you have this many characters sharing the screen. At the same time, I do think it's stronger than the first Avenger. Part of that comes down to confidence. By the time we reach this point, Steve Rogers is no longer a newcomer finding his place in the world. He's a fully formed character. The movie doesn't have to spend time explaining who he is. It can challenge him instead. It can put his values under pressure and see what survives. That's where the trilogy becomes really interesting. The first film asks who Steve Rogers is. The Winter Soldier asks whether he can trust the institutions around him. Civil War asks what happens when the people he trusts most become the ones standing against him. That's a natural progression, and it's one of the reasons this trilogy feels more cohesive than a lot of superhero trilogies. Even though Civil War often feels like an Avengers movie wearing a Captain America title, the emotional center still belongs to Steve. The biggest decisions, the most difficult choices, and the consequences that follow all revolve around him. And honestly, that's what keeps the film grounded. Because underneath all the superhero politics, giant action sequences, and expanding Marvel universe, this still feels like the conclusion of a journey we've been following since a skinny kid from Brooklyn wanted to do the right thing. Maybe that's why I appreciate Civil War as much as I do. It isn't the strongest film in the trilogy for me. I still give that title to the Winter Soldier, but it earns its place. It expands the scope without completely losing sight of the character at the center of it all. And when you look at the trilogy as a whole, that's actually pretty impressive. Very few superhero trilogies manage to evolve this naturally from one film to the next while still feeling connected. Somehow, Captain America's did. By the time Captain America Civil War arrived, the Marvel Cinematic Universe had already become something much bigger than a collection of individual superhero movies. What started with Iron Man had slowly turned into this massive interconnected story, where events, decisions, and even throwaway moments from years earlier could suddenly become important again. And Civil War might be one of the clearest examples of that. The thing is, this movie doesn't really stand alone. That's not necessarily a criticism, but it's definitely part of its identity. Almost everything happening here feels connected to something that came before it. The arguments, the friendships, the grudges, the guilt, none of it appears out of nowhere. You can feel the weight of previous movies hanging over almost every major decision. Tony Stark isn't reacting to one bad day. He's carrying years of mistakes, public scrutiny, and personal regret. Steve Rogers isn't questioning authority because the script suddenly needs conflict. We've already watched his trust in powerful institutions collapse before. Even characters with smaller roles arrive carrying baggage from earlier stories, which gives their choices more meaning than they would have otherwise. That's what makes the conflict work. A lesser version of this movie could have just forced the heroes to fight because audiences wanted to see superheroes punch each other. Instead, Civil War spends a lot of time making sure those divisions feel earned. The film benefits enormously from the fact that we've spent years getting to know these people. And honestly, that's where Marvel's long-term approach really pays off. A lot of cinematic universes have tried to copy what the MCU built, but very few managed to create this feeling that every chapter is building towards something. Watching Civil War, you get the sense that the previous films actually mattered. They weren't just isolated adventures that reset everything once the credits rolled. Actions have consequences. Relationships evolve. Mistakes linger. People remember what happened. That sounds obvious, but it's surprisingly rare in blockbuster franchises. What's interesting is that the movie also feels like a transition point. Up until this stage, the MCU had largely been about bringing heroes together. There were disagreements, sure, but the general direction was always toward unity. Civil War flips that idea on its head. Instead of asking how these heroes can work together, it asks what happens when they stop. That's a pretty significant shift for the franchise. The movie isn't just telling its own story, it's reshaping the future of the MCU. The alliances that existed before aren't as stable anymore. Trust has been damaged. Certain relationships may never fully recover. Even if you don't know where the larger universe is heading, you can feel that something important has changed. And that's part of why the film feels bigger than a typical sequel. It's not simply advancing Captain America's story. It's moving the entire Marvel universe into a new phase. Of course, that also means newcomers might struggle more than usual. If someone walked into Civil War without much familiarity with the previous films, they'd probably still understand the basic plot. But a lot of the emotional impact comes from history. The movie assumes you've spent time with these characters before. The rewards are much greater if you've been following the journey. Thankfully, that's also one of the film's greatest strengths. Rather than feeling like homework, all that continuity gives the story extra depth. Moments hit harder because they have context behind them. Arguments matter because relationships already exist. The movie doesn't have to convince us these characters care about each other. We've already seen it. And because of that, Civil War ends up feeling like one of the MCU's most important chapters, not because it's the biggest. Not because it has the most heroes, but because it proves that years of interconnected storytelling can actually lead somewhere meaningful. One of the most interesting things about Captain America Civil War is that, at some point while you're watching it, you start asking yourself a pretty simple question. Is this actually a Captain America movie? Because let's be honest, the moment the film gets going, it doesn't exactly behave like a traditional solo superhero story. You've got Iron Man playing a role that's far too important to be considered a supporting character. Black Widow is deeply involved in the conflict. Vision, Scarlet Witch, Falcon, War Machine, Hawkeye, Ant-Man, Black Panther, Spider-Man. The list just keeps growing. Before long, the cast starts looking less like a Captain America sequel and more like an Avengers reunion that somehow got completely out of hand. And yet, strangely enough, it still works. At least most of the time. What impressed me is that the film never completely loses sight of who the story belongs to. Even when the screen is packed with heroes, Steve Rogers remains the emotional anchor. The biggest choices revolve around him. The most difficult dilemmas belong to him. The relationships that drive the plot forward are largely connected to him. That's important because a movie like this could very easily become a collection of cameos and fan service moments stitched together by action scenes. There are definitely moments where it flirts with that danger. You can feel the strain occasionally. With so many characters sharing screen time, not everyone receives the same level of attention. A few heroes get pushed toward the background, showing up when the plot needs them, and then quietly stepping aside. There are moments where you can almost see the movie juggling its responsibilities in real time. But credit where it's due, the balancing act is better than I expected. Part of the reason is that most of the major characters arrive with their personalities already established. The film doesn't need to spend 20 minutes explaining who these people are. It can jump straight into the conflict because we've already met them before. That allows the story to focus on relationships rather than introductions. The movie trusts the audience to know who these characters are, and that trust pays off. What's clever is that even the new arrivals don't completely derail the narrative. Black Panther enters the story with a clear purpose. Spider-Man gets a surprisingly memorable introduction despite limited screen time. Ant-Man slips into the larger cast more naturally than I expected. None of them feel like they're randomly wandering into the movie. Well, mostly. There are moments where you can tell Marvel is also setting up future projects. That's just part of the reality of a shared universe. Sometimes you can see the machinery working behind the scenes. A few introductions feel designed not just for this movie, but for what's coming next. Still, it never becomes distracting enough to break the experience. And honestly, that's probably the film's biggest achievement. The more I think about it, the more I realize how difficult this movie should have been to pull off. Managing one superhero is hard enough. Managing a dozen of them, all with different abilities, personalities, motivations, and fan expectations. That sounds like a recipe for chaos, yet somehow the movie remains surprisingly focused. Not perfect, obviously. Some characters are more memorable than others. Some receive stronger material than others. A few probably deserved more development, but the film generally knows where to place its attention and when to bring certain players into the spotlight. By the end, I stopped worrying about whether this was technically a Captain America movie or technically an Avengers movie. Because the truth is it's both. It has the scale, cast size, and spectacle of an Avengers film, but underneath all of that, the story still follows Steve Rogers' journey, his convictions, his friendships, his choices. That's what keeps the film from becoming just another crossover event. It's an ensemble movie, absolutely. One of the biggest Marvel had attempted at that point, but at its core, it still belongs to Captain America. And considering how crowded this movie is, that's honestly kind of impressive. What I like most about Captain America, Civil War, is that its central conflict doesn't come from an alien invasion, a magical artifact, or some unstoppable machine threatening to wipe out humanity. For once, the problem starts with something much more uncomfortable. The Avengers save people. That's what they do. But what happens when saving people also gets people killed? It's a question the Marvel movies had occasionally brushed past before, but Civil War decides to drag it right into the spotlight. The film opens with another mission, another attempt to stop a dangerous threat. On the surface, it's exactly the kind of operation we've seen these heroes complete countless times before. Except this time, things go wrong. Not because the heroes fail completely, but because even success comes with a cost. And suddenly the conversation changes. The focus is no longer on the villains, it's on the Avengers themselves. For years, these heroes have operated with extraordinary freedom. They've traveled where they wanted, fought who they wanted, and made decisions in the heat of the moment. Most of the time, audiences cheer when that happens because we're watching superheroes do superhero things. But from the perspective of ordinary people living in this world, the situation looks very different. Cities get damaged, buildings collapse, lives are lost. Entire communities are left dealing with consequences long after the heroes have moved on to the next mission. That's where the Sokovia Accords enter the story, and honestly, it's a pretty fascinating idea. The proposal is simple on paper. The Avengers would no longer operate independently. Instead, their actions would be overseen by an international authority. Their missions would be approved, monitored, and controlled by people outside the team. It sounds reasonable, at least at first. The beauty of the premise is that it immediately creates a problem without providing an easy answer. You can understand why governments would want oversight. You can understand why citizens would be nervous about a group of superpowered individuals operating without accountability. But at the same time, you can also see why handing that power to politicians and international organizations might create a completely different set of problems. The movie never presents the issue as something obvious. And that's why it works. If one side were clearly correct, there wouldn't really be a story. the conflict would be settled in 5 minutes. Instead, the film builds itself around a dilemma where almost everyone involved has a legitimate argument. That gives the entire narrative a stronger foundation than many superhero movies have. What's interesting is that the premise remains surprisingly grounded despite all the extraordinary characters involved. Strip away the suits, the powers, and the technology, and the movie is really asking a fairly timeless question. Who should be trusted with power, the people who have it, or the institutions that want to control it? That's a debate that exists far beyond comic books, and because of that, the film feels more relevant than a typical superhero spectacle. Even when the story starts expanding, introducing more characters and larger confrontations, everything can still be traced back to that original question. Every alliance, every disagreement, every betrayal, and every fight grows out of the same issue. That's good storytelling. The movie doesn't create conflict for the sake of action. It creates action because conflict already exists. And that's an important distinction. A lot of blockbuster films start with the set pieces and work backwards. Civil War feels like it starts with an idea, a genuinely interesting one, then it lets the characters react to it. Whether every aspect of the execution works is something we'll get into later, but as a premise, it's one of the strongest foundations the MCU had built up to that point. Because instead of asking how the heroes will save the world, it asks whether the world should trust the heroes at all. And that's a much more interesting place to begin. What separates Civil War from a lot of superhero movies is that the fights actually start long before anyone throws a punch. The real battle is an argument, and not even a simple one. Once the Sokovia Accords are introduced, the movie starts asking questions that don't have neat, comfortable answers. In fact, the more you think about them, the messier they become. Because on one side, you have a world that's tired of cleaning up after superheroes, and honestly, can you blame them? From the public's perspective, these aren't just heroes anymore. They're people with the power to level buildings, destroy armies, and influence international events. Even when they're trying to do the right thing, things can still go horribly wrong. That's a scary amount of power for any group to possess, so the argument for oversight makes sense. If governments regulate soldiers, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement, why shouldn't they regulate superheroes too? It's a fair question. The movie never treats it like a ridiculous idea. In fact, there are several moments where you find yourself nodding along with the people demanding accountability. The collateral damage isn't imaginary. The consequences aren't hypothetical. People have died, families have suffered, entire cities have been affected. The world has legitimate reasons to be concerned, but then the film turns the issue around. Because if governments are given control, who exactly decides when the Avengers act? Who decides which crises deserve intervention? Who decides which innocent lives are worth risking? Suddenly, the solution doesn't seem quite so simple anymore. That's where Civil War becomes much more interesting than a standard heroes versus villains story. The debate isn't really about superheroes, it's about power. Who gets to use it, who gets to control it, and whether anyone can truly be trusted with it. The film quietly explores a conflict that has existed throughout history, the tension between security and freedom, between protection and control, between individual judgment and institutional authority. Neither side is completely wrong, and neither side is completely right. That's what gives the movie its weight. A lesser script would have spent 2 hours trying to convince the audience that one viewpoint was obviously correct. Civil War is far more effective because it doesn't do that. Instead, it allows the audience to wrestle with the same uncertainty as the characters. You can understand why some heroes want oversight. You can understand why others fear it. And depending on the scene, your opinion might actually change. One conversation pushes you toward one side, the next conversation pushes you back. That constant tension keeps the film engaging even when nobody is fighting. What's also interesting is how global the issue feels. This isn't portrayed as a problem affecting one city or one country. The discussion expands beyond national borders. Governments, international organizations, and world leaders are all reacting to the existence of these superpowered individuals. For the first time, the MCU really starts treating superheroes as a political issue rather than simply a public attraction. That's an important distinction. The Avengers aren't just celebrities anymore. They're geopolitical factors. They're powerful enough to influence world events, which means world governments inevitably want a say in how that power is used. The movie doesn't spend all its time debating policy, thankfully. It still remembers it's an entertainment-focused blockbuster. But beneath the action, there's a surprisingly thoughtful layer running through the entire story. Questions about accountability, questions about authority, questions about whether good intentions are enough when the consequences can be so enormous. And while Civil War doesn't pretend to have all the answers, I think that's exactly why these themes work. The film understands that the most interesting ethical questions are usually the ones without easy solutions. By the end, you may have chosen a side, most people do. But chances are you'll still understand why the other side believes they're right. And that's what makes the political foundation of civil war much stronger than it initially appears. It isn't trying to win an argument, it's trying to start one. One of the smartest things Captain America, Civil War does is refuse to give the audience an easy answer. Most superhero movies make their conflicts pretty straightforward. There's usually a hero, there's usually a villain, and by the end you know exactly who you're supposed to be rooting for. This movie isn't interested in doing that. In fact, the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to decide who's actually right. And that's where a lot of the film's strength comes from, because despite the title, this isn't really a war between good and evil. It's a clash between two people who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Neither Captain America nor Iron Man wakes up one morning and decides to become the bad guy. Neither one is acting out of selfishness. Neither one is trying to gain power. They're looking at the exact same situation and arriving at completely different conclusions. And honestly, both arguments make sense. That's what makes the conflict feel real. Tony Stark sees a pattern of destruction that keeps repeating itself. He sees innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. He sees mistakes being made by people who answer to nobody except themselves. From his perspective, some level of oversight isn't just reasonable, it's necessary. Steve Rogers looks at the same proposal and sees something entirely different. He sees institutions. He sees governments. He sees organizations that claim to act in the public interest, but can be corrupted, manipulated, or influenced by politics. After everything he's experienced, trusting those systems doesn't come naturally anymore. And that's understandable too. What's interesting is that the film never treats either position as irrational. There are moments where Tony feels completely justified. Then a few scenes later, Steve makes a point that's equally convincing. You keep shifting back and forth, not because the movie is trying to confuse you, but because it's presenting a conflict where both sides have legitimate concerns. That's surprisingly rare in blockbuster filmmaking. Usually when a film claims to explore both sides, it secretly favors one side and spends the entire runtime nudging the audience toward a predetermined conclusion. Civil War feels more balanced than that. The script allows both perspectives to breathe. Both characters are given opportunities to explain themselves. Both characters make mistakes. Both characters let emotions influence their judgment, and both characters suffer because of it. The ideological conflict also works because it never feels purely intellectual. These aren't two politicians debating policy from opposite sides of a table. These are friends, people who have fought together, people who have trusted each other with their lives. That's what raises the emotional stakes. The disagreement isn't happening between strangers. It's happening between people who respect each other, care about each other, and still find themselves unable to compromise. That makes every argument hit harder, because beneath the political discussion, there's a personal tragedy unfolding. The deeper the conflict becomes, the clearer it is that nobody is going to walk away completely satisfied. Someone will lose something, maybe everyone will, and that's really the heart of the movie. Not who wins, not who throws the better punch, not which team gets the most impressive action scene. It's the realization that sometimes two good people can arrive at opposite conclusions and still genuinely believe they're protecting the same thing. That's a much more mature conflict than most superhero films attempt. And whether you leave the movie siding with Captain America, Iron Man, or somewhere in the middle, the important thing is that the film gives you enough reason to understand both. That's why the ideological divide remains compelling long after the action ends, because the debate itself never feels fully resolved. Even now, years later, people still argue about which side was right. And honestly, that's probably one of the strongest compliments you can give a movie built around a moral conflict. A lot of superhero movies ask you to accept character decisions simply because the plot needs them to happen. Somebody changes sides, somebody starts a fight, somebody makes a huge decision, and if you stop to think about it for more than a few seconds, the whole thing starts feeling a little shaky. What makes Civil War different is that, for the most part, the characters don't feel like they're serving the plot. The plot feels like it's growing out of the characters. That's an important difference. One of the reasons the conflict works as well as it does is because nearly everyone involved has a reason for being where they are. Not just a surface-level reason, but something rooted in their experiences, fears, regrets, and personal history. Nobody joins a side because the screenplay randomly assigns them a team color. You can usually trace their decisions back to who they've been throughout the MCU. Take Tony Stark. On the surface, his position seems simple. He supports oversight, but underneath that is years of guilt. Guilt over mistakes he's made, consequences he couldn't control, and damage that keeps following him no matter how hard he tries to move forward. The interesting thing is that Tony isn't operating from confidence here. He's operating from doubt. For perhaps the first time, he genuinely questions whether people like him should be trusted to make every decision on their own. Then you have Steve Rogers. His resistance isn't stubbornness for the sake of stubbornness. It's built from experience. He's watched trusted institutions fail. He's seen corruption hide behind authority. He's learned that following orders isn't always the same thing as doing what's right. So when someone asks him to place his faith in another system, his hesitation feels earned. Even if you disagree with him, you understand him. And that's really the recurring theme throughout the film, understanding. The movie spends a surprising amount of time making sure you understand why people make the choices they do. Sometimes those choices are emotional, sometimes they're rational. Most of the time, they're a mixture of both, because that's how real people tend to work. What's especially interesting is how often grief drives the story. Several major characters are carrying some form of loss. Some have lost family. Some have lost friends. Some are haunted by things they couldn't prevent. Others are struggling with decisions they've already made. Those wounds don't just exist in the background. They actively influence the plot. In many ways, Civil War is a movie about people trying to cope with pain while convincing themselves they're being objective. And that's where things become complicated, because emotions rarely stay neatly separated from principles. People tell themselves they're acting logically, but personal experiences inevitably shape how they see the world. The film understands that. It recognizes that ideology and emotion often become tangled together. That's why the conflict feels human instead of purely political. Even some of the newer characters arrive with clear motivations almost immediately. The movie doesn't waste much time explaining why they're involved. It gives them a purpose, establishes what they want, and allows that motivation to guide their actions moving forward. That efficiency helps a lot when dealing with such a large cast. Of course, not every character receives the same depth. That's probably impossible in a movie this crowded. Some characters are explored more thoroughly than others, but the important thing is that very few major decisions feel arbitrary, whether it's loyalty, responsibility, guilt, trust, revenge, or simply trying to protect the people they care about. The motivations driving the story feel believable within the world these characters inhabit, and because of that, the audience doesn't spend the movie wondering why people are fighting. They're too busy understanding why they feel they have to. That's a subtle distinction, but it's one of the reasons Civil War succeeds, where a lot of hero versus hero stories struggle. The conflict isn't powered by misunderstandings or forced drama. It's powered by people whose experiences have convinced them that they're making the right choice, even when those choices pull them further apart. And honestly, that's what makes the entire situation feel so much more tragic. At the center of all the politics, all the debates, all the airport battles, and all the superhero spectacle, Civil War is really about two people. Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. Everything else is important, sure. The Sokovia Accords matter. The larger MCU implications matter. The supporting characters matter. But strip all of that away, and the emotional engine of this movie is the relationship between these two men. And what makes it work is that the film doesn't try to convince us they're enemies, because they aren't, at least not at the beginning. That's the tragedy of it. When the movie starts, there's still respect there. There are disagreements, absolutely, but there's also history. These are people who have fought side by side. They've trusted each other during impossible situations. They've saved each other's lives. They've carried the weight of the world together more than once. The audience already knows that. The movie doesn't need to spend time proving their friendship because previous films already did the work. Instead, Civil War focuses on showing how that friendship starts to crack, and not all at once. That's what I appreciate about it. The relationship doesn't explode overnight. It slowly unravels. A disagreement becomes frustration. Frustration becomes distrust. Distrust becomes resentment. Every conversation seems to push them a little further apart until eventually they reach a point where neither side can back down anymore. It's uncomfortable to watch, and I mean that as a compliment, because the film understands something a lot of superhero stories forget. Emotional damage can be far more painful than physical damage. Every argument between Steve and Tony carries years of history underneath it. Every disagreement feels personal. Even when they're talking about policies, governments, or security, you can sense something deeper happening. Neither man is really arguing with a stranger. They're arguing with someone whose opinion actually matters to them. That's why the tension feels genuine. What's fascinating is how differently they approach responsibility. Tony increasingly believes accountability requires structure, rules, oversight, some form of external control. Steve believes responsibility comes from personal judgment, conscience, individual choice. Neither philosophy comes out of nowhere. Both positions are completely consistent with who these characters have always been. That's one of the reasons the conflict never feels forced. You can watch the movie and think, of course Tony would feel that way. Then Steve responds and you think, yeah, that sounds exactly like Steve. The movie earns that reaction. It doesn't manufacture a disagreement. It builds upon years of established character development. And then there's the emotional baggage both men bring into the story. Tony is carrying guilt, a lot of it. Guilt over mistakes, guilt over consequences, guilt over things he couldn't fix. Steve is carrying something different. He's carrying loyalty. Loyalty to people. Loyalty to principles. Loyalty to promises he believes shouldn't be broken. Neither man is entirely objective. Neither man is entirely wrong. And because they're both driven by deeply personal convictions, compromise becomes almost impossible. That's where the relationship becomes genuinely heartbreaking, because there are several moments where you can imagine things turning out differently. One different conversation, one different choice, one different piece of information arriving at a different time. Maybe things don't end the way they do, but that's not what happens. Instead, the film keeps tightening the pressure until every unresolved issue between them finally surfaces. By the time the final act arrives, the conflict isn't really about the accords anymore. It's about trust. It's about loyalty. It's about old wounds, and it's about whether two people who once stood together can ever see each other the same way again. That's why the final confrontation works so well, not because it's the biggest fight in the movie. Not because of the choreography, not because of the special effects. It works because the audience understands exactly what's being lost: a friendship, a partnership, a sense of unity that had defined the Avengers for years. And when the dust settles, the real damage isn't measured in broken armor or shattered shields. It's measured in broken relationships. That's what gives Civil War its emotional weight. The movie may be packed with superheroes, but its strongest scenes often feel surprisingly human, because at its heart, this isn't just a story about heroes choosing sides. It's a story about two friends discovering that sometimes doing what you believe is right can come at the cost of the people you care about most. What's interesting about Civil War is that even though Captain America and Iron Man dominate most discussions about the movie, there's another character quietly sitting at the center of almost everything that happens. Bucky Barnes, or more specifically, the Winter Soldier. And the funny thing is, he isn't even driving most of the conflict himself. A lot of the time, he's reacting to events rather than creating them. Yet somehow the entire movie keeps orbiting around him. That's because Bucky isn't just a character in this story. He's history. He's unresolved history. For Steve Rogers, Bucky represents one of the last remaining connections to the life he lost. Before the Avengers, before the ice, before the modern world, there was Bucky. Their friendship stretches back further than almost any relationship in the MCU. So when accusations start flying and the world begins hunting Bucky, Steve's response feels completely natural. Of course he's going to protect him. Of course he's going to believe there's more to the story. At that point, Steve isn't just defending a suspect. He's defending someone he considers family. And that's where things immediately become complicated, because from almost everyone else's perspective, the situation looks very different. The Winter Soldier isn't just Steve's best friend. He's also a man linked to years of violence, assassinations, and destruction. Whether he was acting under his own free will or not becomes almost irrelevant to some of the people pursuing him. The damage has already been done. The reputation already exists. That's what creates so much tension whenever Bucky appears on screen. The audience understands things that many characters don't. We know what happened to him. We know he was manipulated. We know he was turned into a weapon. But knowing that doesn't automatically erase the consequences of his actions, and the film wisely refuses to treat that as a simple issue. What's particularly effective is how Bucky connects the personal and political sides of the story. The Sokovia Accords create one conflict, Bucky creates another. As those two storylines begin overlapping, the situation becomes far more volatile. Suddenly, the debate isn't just about oversight anymore. It's about loyalty, trust, responsibility, and whether people can truly move beyond the things they've done in the past. The movie keeps returning to that question. Can someone who was used as a weapon ever escape the shadow of what they were forced to become? It's one of the more interesting ideas running beneath the larger spectacle. At the same time, Bucky also serves another important function. He's the bridge between Steve and Tony, or maybe it's more accurate to say he's the fracture point between them, because the deeper the story goes, the more his past starts colliding with Tony's. And once that happens, the entire conflict changes shape. What started as an ideological disagreement slowly becomes something much more personal, much more painful. That's why Bucky's role feels larger than his screen time might suggest. He's not constantly delivering speeches. He's not leading armies. He's not trying to take over the world. Instead, his importance comes from what he represents to the people around him. To Steve, he's loyalty. To Tony, he's connected to grief. To others, he's a threat. To some, he's a victim. And all of those perspectives are understandable. That's what makes the character work so well within the story. The film doesn't ask everyone to view him the same way. It understands that different characters will see different versions of him depending on their experiences. And honestly, that's probably why Bucky remains such a crucial piece of Civil War. Not because he's the loudest character, not because he's the most powerful, but because he sits at the crossroads of nearly every major emotional conflict in the movie. The arguments about responsibility, the questions about forgiveness, the breakdown of trust, the collapse of friendships, in one way or another, they all eventually lead back to him. And without that connection, Civil War wouldn't hit nearly as hard as it does. One of the more fascinating things about Captain America, Civil War, is that for a movie filled with superheroes, government disputes, international incidents, and massive action sequences, the villain feels surprisingly small. And I don't mean that as an insult. In fact, that's exactly what makes Helmut Zemo interesting. Because unlike a lot of Marvel villains before him, Zemo isn't trying to conquer the world. He's not opening a portal in the sky. He's not building an unstoppable army. He's not searching for ultimate power. Honestly, compared to most MCU antagonists, his ambitions are almost modest. He just wants to destroy the Avengers, not physically, emotionally. And that's a very different kind of threat. What makes Zemo stand out is that he understands something many villains don't. He knows he can't beat the Avengers in a straight fight. Most people couldn't. So instead of attacking their strengths, he attacks their relationships, their trust, their friendships, their ability to function as a team. That's a much smarter approach. And it's also what makes him feel more dangerous than he initially appears. For a large portion of the movie, Zemo operates in the background. He isn't constantly on screen reminding the audience that he's the villain. In fact, there are moments where he almost disappears from the narrative entirely. Some viewers love that approach, others find it frustrating, and honestly, I can understand both reactions. On one hand, his limited presence can make him feel underdeveloped compared to the emotional conflicts happening between the heroes. There are stretches where Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, and the larger Avengers dispute are so compelling that Zemo almost feels secondary. But on the other hand, that's kind of the point. He's not supposed to dominate the story. He's supposed to manipulate it. The film treats him less like a traditional supervillain and more like a catalyst, someone quietly pushing events in the right direction until everything falls apart on its own. And when you look at the outcome, it's hard to argue that he failed. The Avengers break apart, trust collapses, friendships shatter. The very thing he wanted to accomplish actually happens. What's also interesting is the motivation driving him. At the core of everything is grief, loss, pain, the feeling that powerful people made decisions that destroyed lives and then moved on while everyone else was left dealing with the consequences. That's not exactly an original motivation. Revenge stories have existed forever, but what helps Zemo is that the movie keeps his goals relatively grounded. He's not seeking revenge against humanity. He's seeking revenge against specific people. And because of that, his actions feel personal rather than theatrical. Daniel Bruhl's performance helps a lot here. He doesn't play Zemo like a comic book caricature. There's very little grandstanding, very little dramatic screaming. Most of the time he's calm, controlled, and almost unsettlingly patient. The character understands that time is his greatest weapon. He doesn't need to rush. He just needs to keep pulling at the right threads. That said, I do think Zemo remains one of the most divisive parts of the movie. Some people see him as one of Marvel's strongest villains because he succeeds through intelligence rather than brute force. Others feel his role is too small and that the emotional conflict between the heroes overshadows him completely. Both perspectives have some merit. Personally, I think what makes Zemo memorable isn't who he is, it's what he accomplishes. Years after watching the movie, I don't necessarily remember every detail of his plan. What I remember is the damage, the friendships that were broken, the trust that was lost, the way he turned the Avengers against each other without ever needing powers of his own. And that's a pretty impressive achievement for a character who spends most of the film operating from the shadows. In a genre full of villains trying to destroy the world, Zemo's greatest strength is that he simply lets the heroes destroy themselves. And that's what makes him such an unusual presence in Civil War. One thing I didn't fully appreciate the first time I watched Captain America, Civil War, is just how much of the movie revolves around consequences, not action. not spectacle, not even politics, really, consequences. Almost every major character in this story is dealing with the aftermath of something that already happened. In a lot of superhero movies, the focus is usually on preventing the next disaster. Here, the focus is often on the damage left behind by the previous one, and that's a much more uncomfortable place for a story to live, because there aren't any easy fixes. You can't punch consequences. You can't throw a shield at regret. You can't fly away from guilt. The film keeps forcing its characters to confront things they'd rather avoid, and that's where the themes of revenge and trust start becoming so important. Take Zemo. On the surface, he's the villain. But underneath that, he's also someone consumed by loss. Everything he does is driven by what was taken from him. His entire plan grows out of grief that he never managed to process. Instead of healing, he chooses revenge. And revenge becomes the lens through which he views everything. What's interesting is that the movie doesn't treat revenge as some empowering force. It treats it like a poison. Something that slowly narrows a person's world until they can think about nothing else. Zemo isn't the only example either. You can see traces of that same theme throughout the story. Several characters are carrying anger. Several are carrying grief. Several are trying to cope with painful memories that refuse to stay buried. The difference is how they respond to those feelings. Some try to move forward, others can't. And the movie spends a surprising amount of time exploring the cost of that difference. At the same time, trust is quietly becoming one of the film's most important ideas, or maybe mistrust is the better word. Because almost every major relationship in the movie is tested by it. Can the Avengers trust governments? Can governments trust the Avengers? Can old friends trust each other? Can people trust someone with a dangerous past? Can they trust themselves? The film keeps asking these questions from different angles, and what makes it effective is that trust isn't portrayed as something simple. It's fragile. It takes years to build and sometimes only seconds to break. Once cracks start appearing, they spread quickly. You can see that happening throughout the story. Characters begin withholding information. People start making decisions independently. Conversations become arguments. Arguments become confrontations. The erosion of trust feels gradual, which makes it believable. Nothing collapses overnight. Everything slowly comes apart. Then there are the consequences. The thing I appreciate most is that Civil War never treats actions as isolated events. Every major decision seems to create a ripple effect that impacts someone else. One choice leads to another. One mistake creates another problem. One emotional reaction changes the course of an entire relationship. The film understands that consequences don't always arrive immediately. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they sit quietly in the background for years before finally catching up to people. That's a recurring idea throughout the movie. The past is never really gone. Old decisions keep resurfacing. Old wounds keep reopening. Old mistakes keep demanding attention. And when those things finally collide, the results can be devastating. That's why the emotional weight of Civil War feels different from many superhero films. The stakes aren't primarily about saving the world. The world will probably survive. The real question is whether the people involved can survive what they're doing to each other, whether friendships can survive, whether trust can survive, whether grief can survive without turning into something destructive. Those are much more personal stakes, and in many ways, they're also much more powerful. Because while giant explosions can be entertaining, damaged relationships tend to leave a much deeper mark. That's what gives Civil War much of its emotional depth. Underneath all the costumes and action scenes, it's ultimately a story about what happens when people are forced to face the consequences of their choices. And not everyone is ready for what they find. On paper, Captain America, Civil War sounds like the kind of movie that shouldn't work. Seriously, if you tried explaining the plot to someone before they watched it, it would sound completely overloaded. You've got the Sokovia Accords, a divided Avengers team, the Winter Soldier, Zemo's plan, international politics, multiple new characters being introduced, existing relationships being tested, several personal storylines carrying over from previous films. That's a lot. Honestly, too much for many movies. And yet, somehow, Civil War manages to keep all of those moving parts from completely collapsing under their own weight. Now, does it always succeed perfectly? Not quite. There are definitely moments where you can feel the strain. Certain subplots receive more attention than others. Some storylines feel more fully developed. A few ideas probably could have benefited from additional breathing room, but considering how much the film is trying to accomplish, the overall structure is surprisingly impressive. What I like is that the movie never feels like it's telling just one story. It's telling several stories at the same time. There's a political thriller hiding inside it. There's a friendship drama. There's an investigation. There's a revenge story. There's even a debate about power, responsibility, and accountability running beneath everything else. Normally, mixing that many narrative threads can become messy very quickly. Here, most of them feed into one another. That's the key difference. Instead of feeling like separate plots fighting for attention, they gradually start overlapping. One storyline pushes another forward. A personal conflict affects a political conflict. A political decision triggers an emotional reaction. An emotional reaction creates a new problem. Everything stays connected, and because of that, the story keeps moving. What's particularly interesting is how the movie balances large-scale events with personal stakes. A lot of blockbusters struggle with this. The bigger the story becomes, the harder it is to maintain emotional focus. But Civil War generally avoids that problem because it never loses sight of the characters driving the narrative. Even when governments are involved, even when the Avengers split apart, even when entire airports become battlegrounds, the story remains rooted in individual decisions. That's why the film rarely feels detached despite its scale. Another thing worth mentioning is how much the movie benefits from previous MCU entries. This isn't a story starting from scratch. It's building upon years of established relationships, conflicts, and character development. That allows the narrative to move much faster than it otherwise could. The film doesn't need to spend large portions of its runtime explaining who these people are or why they matter. It assumes you already know. For longtime viewers, that's a major advantage. The emotional shortcuts available to the story make the structure feel much richer than it would in isolation. At the same time, that interconnected approach can create challenges. If someone isn't familiar with earlier films, certain moments may not land with the same impact. Some relationships carry emotional weight because of previous stories rather than because of anything established here. So the complexity is both a strength and a weakness depending on your perspective. What keeps everything together, though, is momentum. The movie rarely sits still for very long. Every scene seems to introduce a new piece of information, deepen a relationship, raise a question, or complicate an existing conflict. There's a constant sense of progression. Even when the film pauses for quieter conversations, those scenes are usually moving the larger narrative forward in some way. That prevents the complexity from becoming exhausting. You're always learning something, always discovering another layer, always getting closer to understanding why everything is falling apart. Of course, there are still moments where the movie feels slightly overcrowded. Some subplots are stronger than others. Some character arcs receive more attention than others. That's inevitable in a story this ambitious. But ambition is probably the word that best describes Civil War's narrative design. The film could have settled for a simple, heroes fight heroes premise and called it a day. Instead, it builds a layered, interconnected story that tries to juggle politics, emotion, action, mystery, revenge, and character drama all at once. And while it occasionally stumbles under that weight, it's hard not to admire how much it successfully holds together. Because when the final credits roll, what stays with you isn't just the action. It's the feeling that everything was connected. Every choice, every relationship, every conflict, every consequence. That's what gives the story its complexity. And more importantly, that's what makes it feel larger than a typical superhero movie. One area where Captain America. Civil War doesn't get enough credit, at least in my opinion, is the writing. And I don't mean the big speeches. I don't mean the dramatic declarations before a fight. I mean the actual construction of scenes. The way information is delivered, the way conversations reveal character, the way seemingly small moments quietly set up things that won't pay off until much later. That's where the screenplay is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because when you stop and think about it, this movie has an enormous amount of information to communicate. New characters need introductions. Existing characters need development. Political issues need explanation. Emotional conflicts need progression. Future plot points need setup. That's a dangerous amount of material for any blockbuster. A less disciplined script could have easily become a series of exposition dumps. Instead, Civil War usually finds ways to hide information inside natural interactions. That's something I really appreciate. Characters often reveal who they are while accomplishing several other things at the same time. A conversation might be advancing the plot, developing a relationship, and setting up a future conflict all within a few minutes. Good screenwriting often looks effortless. This movie has several moments that feel that way. Take the scenes involving Tony Stark early on. They aren't just there to explain the story. They're also revealing guilt, regret, emotional vulnerability, and unresolved personal issues that become increasingly important as the film progresses. The audience learns information, but it never feels like the movie is stopping to lecture us. That's a difficult balance to achieve. The same applies to many of the smaller character interactions scattered throughout the film. Some conversations are funny, some are awkward, some are emotional, but most of them have a purpose beyond simply filling time. The dialogue generally feels efficient without feeling mechanical. That's an important distinction. Because there's a difference between characters talking and characters communicating. In weaker blockbusters, conversations often exist solely to move the plot from point A to point B. Here, even casual exchanges tend to reveal something useful about the people involved. You learn how they think, you learn what they value, you learn what they're afraid of. And occasionally, you learn what they're trying very hard not to say. That's where the writing becomes most effective. The humor helps too. Marvel movies are obviously known for jokes, but what works in Civil War is that the comedy usually grows out of personality rather than feeling randomly inserted. Different characters are funny in different ways. Spider-Man's enthusiasm feels different from Tony Stark's sarcasm. Ant-Man's awkwardness creates a completely different type of humor. The film generally understands those distinctions. As a result, the comedy doesn't make everyone sound like the same person, at least most of the time. What's also impressive is how the screenplay handles the ideological debate at the center of the story. Both sides are given opportunities to explain themselves. Neither viewpoint feels ignored. The movie allows important conversations to happen without immediately rushing toward the next explosion. That patience makes the conflict feel more believable. People aren't just fighting because the script needs a battle scene. They're arguing because they genuinely disagree. Of course, the writing isn't flawless. There are moments where certain ideas could have been explored more deeply. A few storylines feel slightly compressed. Some emotional beats work better than others. That's inevitable in a movie juggling this many characters and narrative threads. But even when the screenplay occasionally rushes a subplot, it rarely loses sight of its priorities. Character first, conflict second, spectacle third, and that's probably why so much of the film works. The action may be what audiences remember. The airport battle may dominate the marketing. But underneath all of that, there's a screenplay constantly working to make those moments matter, because action without context is just noise. The writing understands that. It spends the entire movie building relationships, motivations, tensions, and emotional stakes so that when characters eventually clash, the audience understands exactly why. That's not always easy in a superhero blockbuster, but Civil War pulls it off more often than not. And honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons the movie holds together as well as it does. The more I revisit Captain America. Civil War, the more I think one of the film's biggest strengths isn't any individual action scene, character, or plot twist. It's the fact that the whole thing somehow stays under control. And honestly, that's where the Russo brothers deserve a lot of credit, because when you look at what they're actually managing here, it's kind of ridiculous. This isn't a movie with one lead character and a straightforward story. It's a film juggling multiple protagonists, conflicting ideologies, political themes, emotional baggage from previous movies, several major action sequences, new character introductions, and enough interconnected storylines to make a lesser production completely collapse under its own weight. Yet somehow it rarely feels chaotic. That's not an accident. That's direction. One thing the Russos seem to understand better than many blockbuster filmmakers is clarity. Not visual clarity alone, although that matters too, emotional clarity. No matter how large the movie becomes, you're usually aware of what people want, why they want it, and what's preventing them from getting it. That sounds simple, but it's surprisingly difficult when you're dealing with a cast this large. There are scenes involving 6, 7, sometimes even more important characters sharing the screen at once, yet the film rarely loses track of who matters in a given moment. The camera knows where to focus. The scene knows what it's trying to accomplish. The audience isn't left wondering why they're watching something. That's a skill. What's particularly impressive is how the Russos handle tone, because Civil War is constantly walking a dangerous line. The movie deals with death, guilt, accountability, broken friendships, and revenge. Those are heavy themes, very heavy themes. At the same time, this is still a Marvel movie. There are jokes, there are absurd situations. There are characters dressed in colorful costumes fighting each other in an airport. On paper, that combination shouldn't always work, yet the film rarely feels like it's switching personalities from scene to scene. The transitions are surprisingly smooth. Humorous moments don't completely undermine dramatic scenes. Dramatic scenes don't smother the fun. The balance feels carefully managed. That's something I appreciate more with each viewing. Another strength of the Russo brothers is their understanding of character dynamics. A lot of directors can stage action. A lot fewer can make conversations feel just as important. Some of the strongest moments in Civil War aren't action scenes at all. They're discussions, arguments, quiet exchanges between people trying to convince each other they're right. The Russos give those moments room to breathe. They don't rush through them just to get to the next fight. As a result, the emotional conflict often feels as important as the physical conflict, and that's exactly how it should be. The action only works because the relationships work first. You can actually see that philosophy throughout the movie. The directors never seem interested in spectacle for its own sake. Even the biggest set pieces are usually connected to a larger emotional purpose. People aren't fighting random enemies. They're fighting friends, former allies, people they care about. The Russos understand that distinction and keep returning to it. Of course, directing a film this ambitious isn't without challenges. There are occasional moments where the sheer number of characters creates pressure on the narrative. A few storylines could arguably use more attention. Some characters naturally receive more focus than others, but considering the scale of the task, the overall result is remarkably cohesive. What impresses me most is that Civil War never feels like a movie desperately trying to impress you with how much stuff it contains. It could have easily become that. The cast alone would tempt many filmmakers into turning the film into a non-stop parade of cameos and fan service moments. Instead, the Russos keep bringing the focus back to the conflict, back to the relationships, back to the choices these characters are making. That discipline is a big reason the movie works. By the end, you're not thinking about how difficult the production must have been. You're thinking about the story. You're thinking about the characters. You're thinking about the consequences. And honestly, that's probably the strongest compliment you can give any director. When a movie this large feels this controlled, somebody behind the camera is doing a lot of things right. And Civil War is one of the clearest examples of that in the MCU. One of the biggest challenges facing Captain America, Civil War, was never the action. It was the people, because action scenes are expected in a movie like this. Audiences show up expecting explosions, fights, and superheroes crashing through walls. That's the easy part. The difficult part is making the audience care about more than a dozen major characters at the same time. And for the most part, Civil War pulls that off surprisingly well. What immediately stands out is that very few characters feel interchangeable. That's a problem a lot of ensemble movies run into. Once the cast gets large enough, personalities start blending together. People become defined by costumes or powers rather than who they actually are. That rarely happens here. You can usually tell who's speaking even before the camera reveals them. Tony Stark doesn't sound like Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers doesn't sound like Sam Wilson. Sam Wilson doesn't sound like Peter Parker. Peter Parker definitely doesn't sound like T'Challa. Everyone approaches situations differently, reacts differently, and views the conflict through their own lens. That's important because the movie's central debate only works if the characters genuinely feel like individuals. Otherwise, the two sides would just look like random teams assembled for a fight scene. Instead, every major player seems to arrive with their own perspective. Some are motivated by loyalty, some by responsibility, some by guilt, some by personal history. Some simply believe they're choosing the lesser of two bad options. And because the film spends time establishing those viewpoints, the division among the Avengers feels organic. Nobody feels like they're standing on a particular side because the screenplay assigned them there. The choices generally make sense. What's impressive is how much characterization the movie achieves without constantly stopping the narrative. A lot of these characters have limited screen time compared to the leads, yet most still leave a clear impression, a brief conversation, a reaction during an argument, a decision made under pressure. Sometimes that's all the film needs to communicate who someone is. That's efficient storytelling. The movie trusts the audience to understand character through behavior rather than endless explanation, and that trust usually pays off. Another thing I appreciate is that the film remembers these characters have relationships outside of the central conflict. Not every interaction revolves around the Sokovia Accords. People joke with each other, disagree with each other, protect each other, annoy each other. Those smaller moments help create the feeling that these heroes actually know one another beyond the immediate plot. It gives the ensemble a sense of history, a sense of familiarity, a sense that these people have spent years working together. That becomes incredibly important once the conflict escalates, because when the friendships feel real, the division feels real too. You start paying attention to more than just who wins a fight. You start caring about who is standing opposite whom. That's a much stronger form of investment. What's particularly impressive is how the film manages to make room for both established characters and newcomers. Returning heroes continue developing existing arcs, while new arrivals are introduced without completely derailing the story. That's not an easy balance to strike, especially when audience expectations for certain characters are already sky-high. Of course, no ensemble this large can give equal attention to everyone. That's simply impossible. Some characters naturally emerge as more important than others. Some receive richer material. Some contribute more to the emotional core of the story. That's inevitable. But the fact that so many characters remain memorable despite those limitations is a testament to how well the ensemble is handled overall. By the time the movie reaches its biggest moments, the cast doesn't feel like a collection of superheroes gathered for an event. It feels like a community that's beginning to fracture, friends taking different paths, allies choosing different principles, people who care about each other finding themselves on opposite sides of an argument they can't resolve. And that's what gives the ensemble its strength. The movie isn't just presenting a lot of characters, it's presenting a lot of perspectives, a lot of emotions, a lot of competing beliefs, and somehow it manages to make room for all of them without completely losing focus. That's a difficult thing to achieve, especially in a blockbuster of this size, yet Civil War makes it look almost effortless. Now, as much as I admire what Civil War accomplishes with its enormous cast, this is probably the point where we have to talk about the other side of that conversation. Because having a huge ensemble is impressive, using every character equally well, that's a completely different challenge, and honestly, Civil War doesn't always pull that off. The film does a remarkably good job considering how many heroes are involved, but there are still moments where you can feel certain characters getting squeezed by the sheer size of the story. It's almost unavoidable. When you're trying to balance Captain America, Iron Man, Bucky, Black Widow, Black Panther, Spider-Man, Vision, Scarlet Witch, Falcon, War Machine, Hawkeye, Ant-Man, and several others, somebody is eventually going to get less attention. There's only so much screen time available. That's just reality. The most obvious issue is that not every character receives the same level of development. Some heroes are deeply tied to the emotional core of the story. Their decisions matter, their relationships drive the narrative, their actions have visible consequences. Others feel more like participants than drivers. They're present, they're entertaining, they're useful, but they aren't necessarily essential. You could argue that a few characters are there primarily because the movie needs bodies on both sides of the conflict. That's not necessarily a fatal flaw, but it's noticeable. War Machine is probably one of the clearest examples. He's involved in major events, and he certainly isn't irrelevant, but compared to the emotional attention given to Steve, Tony, or Bucky, he often feels pushed toward the edges of the story. You remember what happens to him. You remember his role in certain scenes, but you don't always feel like the movie is exploring his perspective with the same depth as others. A similar argument could be made for several supporting players. Some receive strong moments. Some receive memorable scenes, but not all of them receive complete arcs, and that's where the movie occasionally shows the limits of its ambition. Another interesting issue involves the newcomers. On one hand, introducing Spider-Man and Black Panther is one of the film's biggest successes. On the other hand, you can occasionally sense the larger Marvel machine at work. There are moments where it feels like the movie is doing double duty, telling its own story, while simultaneously preparing audiences for future projects. Most of the time it handles that balancing act well. But every now and then, you become aware that certain scenes aren't only serving Civil War. They're also planting seeds for what comes next. That can make some introductions feel slightly strategic rather than entirely organic. Again, not a huge problem, just something you notice. The other challenge comes from the film's structure itself. Because there are so many moving parts, some character threads inevitably receive more attention than others. The movie knows where its priorities are. Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, Bucky Barnes, the central ideological conflict. Everything else exists slightly beneath that level. As a result, characters connected directly to those storylines tend to fare better than characters operating on the periphery. That's not unusual for ensemble storytelling, but it's still worth acknowledging. What saves the film from becoming frustrating is that even underused characters usually remain likable. You may want more of them, but you rarely want less. That's an important distinction. The movie leaves you wishing certain heroes had additional scenes rather than wishing they weren't there at all. In many ways, that's a sign that the characterization is working. People become attached to these characters quickly enough that they notice when someone isn't getting enough attention. That's actually a compliment disguised as criticism, because if audiences are asking for more screen time, it usually means the movie succeeded in making them care. Still, it's one of the areas where Civil War occasionally shows its limitations. The cast is simply too large for everyone to receive equal treatment. Some characters thrive, some characters survive, and a few characters spend portions of the movie waiting for the spotlight to come back around. Thankfully, the film's strongest characters are strong enough to carry the emotional weight of the story. But it's impossible to ignore that certain members of this massive ensemble get a better deal than others. That's the trade-off that comes with a movie this ambitious. You gain scale, you gain variety, you gain spectacle. But sometimes you sacrifice a little depth along the way. Let's be honest for a second. When Captain America: Civil War was first released, a huge portion of the excitement surrounding the movie had absolutely nothing to do with the Sokovia Accords, political debates, or the Avengers splitting apart. People wanted to see Spider-Man, and not just any Spider-Man. This was Marvel Studios finally getting a chance to bring the character into the MCU. That alone carried an incredible amount of pressure. By this point, audiences had already seen multiple live-action versions of Spider-Man. The character wasn't new. The challenge wasn't introducing him. The challenge was convincing people that this version deserved to exist. And surprisingly, Civil War manages to do that in a very short amount of time. What's remarkable is how little screen time Peter Parker actually gets. If you think about it, he's not in the movie for very long. Yet somehow he leaves one of the strongest impressions. A lot of that comes down to how efficiently the film introduces him. The movie doesn't spend half an hour explaining his origin story. It doesn't pause everything to launch into a lengthy backstory. It trusts the audience to already know the basics. He's Spider-Man. Most people know the rest. That decision allows the film to focus on something much more important: personality, and this is where Tom Holland immediately stands out. From the moment he appears, there's an energy to the character that feels different from almost everyone else in the movie. Most of the Avengers are carrying baggage. They're dealing with guilt, responsibility, political disagreements, broken friendships, and years of emotional history. Peter arrives completely outside of that world. He's excited, he's nervous, he's talkative. He's genuinely thrilled to be involved, and that youthful enthusiasm becomes a breath of fresh air. What's interesting is that the humor works for the same reason. Spider-Man isn't funny because he's trying to be the coolest person in the room. He's funny because he feels like a teenager, suddenly finding himself surrounded by legends. His excitement becomes part of the comedy. His curiosity becomes part of the comedy. Even his tendency to talk a little too much becomes part of the comedy. The result is a version of Peter Parker that feels noticeably different from many of the MCU's existing heroes. He brings a different kind of energy, a different kind of optimism, a different kind of perspective, and the movie benefits from that. The airport battle is probably where this becomes most obvious. Despite sharing the screen with some of Marvel's biggest characters, Spider-Man never disappears into the background. In fact, some of the sequence's most memorable moments belong to him, not because he's the strongest fighter, not because he's the most important character, but because he approaches everything with such visible excitement that it's difficult not to enjoy watching him. That said, the introduction isn't completely without criticism. Some viewers felt his arrival was slightly abrupt. Others questioned whether he fit naturally into the larger narrative or whether he occasionally felt like a setup for future films. And honestly, I can understand that perspective. The movie is clearly aware of how significant Spider-Man's MCU debut is. There are moments where you can almost feel the audience excitement built directly into the scene. But even then, I think the character largely earns his place. Because once Peter is actually on screen, the focus quickly shifts from the novelty of his appearance to the quality of the character itself. That's the important part. A cameo can generate excitement. A good characterization creates investment, and Civil War does a surprisingly effective job of accomplishing both. What impresses me most is that the movie understands Spider-Man isn't memorable because of his powers. He's memorable because of who he is: the awkwardness, the enthusiasm, the humor, the genuine desire to help. Those traits come through almost immediately. By the time he leaves the film, you don't feel like you've watched a marketing exercise. You feel like you've met a character. And that's probably the biggest compliment you can give any introduction, especially one carrying this much expectation. Because in a movie overflowing with superheroes, Spider-Man doesn't just show up. He announces himself, and somehow manages to feel right at home almost immediately. If Spider-Man brings youthful energy into Civil War, then Black Panther brings something completely different: presence. From the moment T'Challa enters the story, there's a sense that this character operates on a different wavelength than everyone around him. He isn't trying to impress anyone, he isn't cracking jokes, he isn't looking for approval, he's focused, and more importantly, he's carrying a very specific kind of pain. What makes Black Panther's introduction so effective is that it doesn't feel like an advertisement for a future movie. Obviously, we know now that Marvel was building towards something bigger, but within Civil War itself, T'Challa arrives with a clear purpose. He's not here to expand the universe. He's here because the story gives him a reason to be. That's an important distinction. A lot of cinematic universes struggle with introducing new characters because those introductions can feel forced. Sometimes it feels like a movie suddenly pauses so it can sell audiences on the next project. Black Panther never really suffers from that problem. His role is woven directly into the central conflict. His motivations are easy to understand, and because those motivations are rooted in personal loss, the audience connects with him almost immediately. The interesting thing is that T'Challa's journey mirrors some of the larger themes running throughout the film. At first, he's driven by revenge, not justice, not accountability, revenge, and honestly, given the circumstances, it's difficult to blame him. The movie doesn't ask us to agree with every decision he makes, but it does make us understand why he's making them. That's one of the strengths of the character. His actions never feel random. Every choice grows out of emotion, grief, and a desire to make sense of what has happened. What elevates the character, though, is that his story doesn't stay there. A lesser film might have left him trapped in that revenge arc from beginning to end. Instead, Civil War allows him to evolve. As events unfold, T'Challa begins to recognize something important. Revenge doesn't heal anything. It doesn't bring people back. It doesn't erase pain. It simply creates more damage. That's a realization several characters in the movie struggle to reach, which makes his growth particularly meaningful. And because of that, Black Panther ends up becoming one of the film's more quietly compelling figures. He starts as someone consumed by anger. He ends as someone willing to rise above it. That's a strong character arc, especially considering how little screen time he actually has compared to the main players. A lot of the credit belongs to Chadwick Boseman. There's a calm authority to his performance that immediately separates T'Challa from the rest of the cast. He doesn't need lengthy speeches. He doesn't need exaggerated emotional moments. The character's strength often comes from restraint, from the way he carries himself, from the way he observes situations before acting, from the sense that he's constantly thinking several steps ahead. That kind of presence is difficult to create, but Boseman makes it feel effortless. What's also impressive is how quickly the movie establishes the larger potential of the character. Even though Civil War is focused on its own story, you leave with the feeling that there's much more to explore. Not because the film tells you there is, because the character naturally creates that curiosity. You want to know more about him, more about his world, more about his responsibilities, more about what comes next. That's exactly what a great introduction should accomplish. And unlike some supporting characters who occasionally feel lost within the film's massive ensemble, Black Panther consistently feels important. Every appearance matters. Every decision influences the narrative. Every scene moves his journey forward. By the end of the movie, he's done something surprisingly difficult. He's introduced a brand new hero into an already crowded story and somehow emerged as one of its most memorable characters. Not through spectacle, not through flashy powers, but through purpose, growth, and emotional clarity. And that's a big reason why his introduction remains one of the strongest elements of Civil War. Out of all the characters who show up in Civil War, Ant-Man might be the easiest one to underestimate. He's not at the center of the political debate. He's not carrying years of emotional baggage like Tony Stark or Steve Rogers. He's not being introduced as a major new franchise cornerstone like Spider-Man or Black Panther. In fact, when he first enters the movie, he almost feels like an outsider looking in. And honestly, that's exactly why he works. Because while most of the cast is dealing with incredibly serious issues, Scott Lang arrives with a completely different energy. He's just happy to be there. That sounds simple, but it makes a huge difference. By the time Ant-Man joins the story, Civil War has already spent a lot of time discussing accountability, responsibility, trust, and fractured relationships. The movie has earned that seriousness, but it also needs occasional moments where the audience can breathe. Scott Lang provides those moments, not because he's a joke character. That's an important distinction. The movie never treats him like comic relief who exists solely to deliver punchlines. Instead, the humor comes naturally from who he is. He's an ordinary guy suddenly finding himself standing beside some of the most famous heroes in the world. And he reacts exactly how many people probably would, with excitement, with awkwardness, with a little disbelief. There are moments where he seems just as impressed by the Avengers as the audience is. That perspective makes him instantly relatable. What's especially fun is how Scott's personality contrasts with everyone around him. Most of the characters in this film have been living inside the superhero world for years. They've become accustomed to impossible situations. Scott hasn't, so when extraordinary things happen, he still reacts like a human being rather than a seasoned superhero. That freshness gives the movie a different rhythm whenever he's on screen. The audience gets reminded that all of this is actually kind of ridiculous, in the best possible way. Of course, Ant-Man isn't just there for comedy. The film also uses him effectively during the action sequences. In fact, some of the movie's biggest crowd-pleasing moments involve him. Part of that comes from how unique his abilities are compared to everyone else. Most heroes solve problems through strength, speed, technology, or energy blasts. Scott's powers create opportunities for visual creativity. The filmmakers clearly understand that. Whenever Ant-Man enters a fight scene, things immediately become more unpredictable. You start wondering what weird solution he's going to come up with next. That unpredictability makes him incredibly entertaining to watch. What's interesting is that despite having less screen time than many of the major players, Ant-Man still leaves a strong impression. That's usually a sign that a character is being used effectively. The movie knows exactly what role he serves and doesn't overcomplicate it. He isn't trying to dominate the story. He isn't trying to steal the emotional spotlight. He's simply adding another perspective to an already crowded conflict, and in doing so, he helps keep the film balanced, because one of the risks of civil war is that it could easily become too heavy, too serious, too focused on political arguments and emotional fallout. Ant-Man helps prevent that. He reminds the audience that superhero movies are also supposed to be fun, not shallow, not meaningless, just fun. And that's an important difference. The best part is that the humor never comes at the expense of the story. Scott's presence doesn't undermine the stakes. It doesn't weaken the conflict. If anything, it makes the more dramatic moments work better, because the movie isn't operating at maximum intensity every second. It understands the value of contrast. By the end, Ant-Man may not be the character people discuss the most when talking about Civil War. The biggest conversations usually revolve around Captain America, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Black Panther, or Zemo. But remove Scott Lang from the movie, and you'd immediately feel the loss, not because he's essential to every plot development, because he adds something no one else does, a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of unpredictability. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that even in the middle of a superhero civil war, it's still okay to have a little fun. One thing that often gets overlooked when people talk about Civil War is how much of the movie's emotional texture comes from the smaller relationships operating in the background. The big headlines are obvious: Captain America versus Iron Man, the Sokovia Accords, the Avengers splitting apart. Those are the conversations everyone remembers, but underneath all of that, there are quieter relationships constantly influencing the story. And some of them are surprisingly important. The most interesting example is probably Scarlet Witch and Vision, because while the larger conflict is political on the surface, their relationship turns it into something deeply personal. What's fascinating is that neither of them fully fits into the debate happening around them. Vision approaches situations logically. He looks at probabilities, consequences, and patterns. He tends to view problems from a broader perspective. Wanda, on the other hand, experiences the consequences of those decisions directly. She's one of the characters most affected by public fear and political pressure. That creates an unusual dynamic. They're drawn toward one another, yet the circumstances around them keep pushing them into uncomfortable positions, and the movie handles that tension fairly well. The relationship isn't treated as a grand romance dominating the narrative. Instead, it's presented through small moments, conversations, shared scenes, brief interactions. The kind of moments that quietly suggest something larger developing beneath the surface. That's usually more effective than forcing an emotional storyline too quickly. What's particularly interesting is how trust becomes a major factor in their relationship. Trust is obviously one of the film's central themes overall, but it becomes especially visible here. As the conflict escalates, both characters begin facing situations where loyalty, freedom, and responsibility collide. The more pressure the outside world applies, the harder it becomes to maintain simple trust between individuals. And that's something the movie explores through their interactions. It's subtle, but it's there. The relationship becomes another example of how the larger political conflict affects personal lives, which is exactly what good storytelling should do. Large events should have personal consequences, otherwise they remain abstract. Scarlet Witch and Vision help make those consequences feel real. Beyond them, there are several other supporting relationships quietly shaping the story. Steve Rogers and Sharon Carter, for example. It's not a dominant subplot, but it's present enough to influence certain moments. Reactions to that relationship have always been mixed, and even within the film, it sometimes feels less emotionally developed than some of the other connections surrounding Steve. Still, it serves a purpose. It reinforces the idea that Steve is trying to build a life in a world that often feels disconnected from the one he lost. Then there are the friendships scattered throughout the Avengers themselves. Some of the movie's strongest moments don't come from romantic relationships at all. They come from friendships being tested, people who have fought together suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides. Former allies questioning each other's judgment. Teammates realizing that agreement isn't guaranteed anymore. Those relationships matter because they add emotional stakes beyond the physical conflict. The audience isn't just watching heroes fight, they're watching connections break. That's a much more compelling form of drama. What's impressive is that Civil War doesn't need lengthy scenes to communicate most of this. A glance, a conversation, a moment of hesitation during a confrontation. The film often trusts the audience to understand what these relationships mean without constantly explaining them, and generally, that's the right choice. Because the emotional weight feels more natural that way. By the end of the movie, it's not only the Avengers organization that feels fractured. Individual relationships have been strained as well. Some bonds survive, some change. Some may never fully recover, and that's exactly why these supporting relationships matter. They remind us that the conflict isn't just affecting teams and institutions, it's affecting people, one friendship, one partnership, one relationship at a time. And in a movie filled with superheroes, that's often where the most human moments can be found. A movie like Captain America, Civil War lives or dies on its cast. That might sound obvious, but think about what's being asked of these actors. They're not just playing superheroes anymore. They're playing superheroes who have already existed across multiple films, who already have established relationships, histories, grudges, loyalties, and emotional scars. The audience knows these characters. In some cases, they've known them for nearly a decade, so simply showing up in costume isn't enough. The performances have to make all of that history feel real, and for the most part, they absolutely do. Let's start with Chris Evans. At this point, Evans seems so naturally suited to Steve Rogers that it's easy to take his work for granted. What's impressive isn't that he plays Captain America as heroic. Plenty of actors could do that. What's impressive is that he makes Steve's stubbornness feel admirable and frustrating at the same time. There are moments where you completely understand why people follow him. And there are moments where you completely understand why people disagree with him. That's a difficult balance to maintain. A lesser performance could have turned Steve into either an inflexible saint or a reckless idealist. Evans avoids both extremes. He keeps the character human. Even when you disagree with his decisions, you rarely doubt his sincerity. Then there's Robert Downey Jr. And honestly, this might be one of the strongest performances he gives in the MCU. What I like most is how much pain sits beneath Tony Stark throughout the movie. The sarcasm is still there. The confidence is still there. The quick wit hasn't disappeared, but underneath it all, there's exhaustion, regret, guilt. That enthusiasm becomes contagious. Meanwhile, Ant-Man brings his own brand of unpredictability. Every time he appears, you get the feeling that something ridiculous might happen, and usually it does. The result is a sequence that somehow manages to be funny, exciting, dramatic, and emotionally complicated all at the same time. That's not easy. Most action scenes choose one lane and stay there. The airport battle somehow operates in several lanes simultaneously. Another reason the sequence works is because the audience understands the relationships behind every confrontation. When two random superheroes fight, the spectacle can be entertaining. When two friends fight, the spectacle gains emotional weight. That's exactly what's happening here. You aren't just watching powers collide, you're watching loyalties collide. Beliefs collide, friendships collide. That's what gives the scene its staying power. It's also worth mentioning how creative the action becomes. The filmmakers clearly understand that simply watching heroes punch each other for 15 minutes wouldn't be enough. So they constantly look for new combinations, new interactions, and new uses for each character's abilities. The battle feels playful in the best sense of the word. There's a sense of imagination running through it. You can feel the filmmakers enjoying the possibilities created by bringing all these characters together. And thankfully, that enthusiasm transfers directly to the audience. Of course, if we're being critical, the airport battle isn't necessarily the most emotionally devastating sequence in the film. That comes later. Some viewers even argue that the consequences here feel relatively limited compared to the darker events surrounding it. That's a fair observation, but I think it misses what the sequence is trying to accomplish. The airport battle isn't meant to be the emotional climax. It's meant to be the payoff to the central premise. The moment where all the disagreements finally become physical, and in that regard, it succeeds brilliantly. Years after the movie's release, people still talk about this scene, still quote moments from it, still debate their favorite matchups, still remember specific character interactions. That's usually a sign that a blockbuster sequence has done something right, because great action scenes aren't just exciting while you're watching them, they stay with you afterward. And the airport battle absolutely does. It's fun, it's creative, it's character-driven. And somehow, despite containing more superheroes than some entire franchises, it never loses sight of what makes the conflict interesting in the first place. That's why it remains one of the defining sequences, not just of Civil War, but of the MCU as a whole. As incredible as the airport battle is, one of the smartest decisions Civil War makes is refusing to end there. Because if the movie had treated that sequence as the ultimate climax, it probably would have been remembered as a very entertaining superhero spectacle. Instead, it chooses something much riskier, something much smaller, and somehow much more powerful. After spending most of the movie expanding outward, more heroes, more locations, more action, more political complications, the story suddenly narrows its focus. By the time we reach the final confrontation, the massive conflict that once involved governments, international agreements, and divided teams has been reduced to something intensely personal. 3 people, 1 location. Years of history, that's it. And honestly, that's exactly why it works. The airport battle impresses because of scale. The final confrontation hurts because of emotion. The movie understands that there's only so much spectacle can accomplish. Eventually, the audience needs something deeper than visual excitement. They need a reason to care. The final act delivers that reason. What's remarkable is how different the energy feels compared to earlier action scenes. The airport battle is fun. This isn't, not really. Even before the fighting begins, there's a heaviness hanging over everything. The humor largely disappears. The excitement fades. What's left is tension, pure tension. The kind that comes from knowing nobody is going to walk away emotionally intact. That's what separates this confrontation from most superhero finales. Normally, the audience is cheering. They're waiting for the hero to save the day. They're anticipating a triumphant victory. Here, the feeling is completely different. You don't necessarily want anybody to win, because every possible outcome feels painful. That's a rare achievement. The emotional foundation for this scene has been building throughout the entire movie. Every disagreement, every broken promise, every damaged relationship, every piece of hidden history, everything eventually leads here. And because the film has spent so much time developing those relationships, the confrontation feels earned. Nothing about it feels forced. Nothing feels manufactured. The movie isn't creating drama for the sake of having a dramatic ending. It's allowing years of unresolved tension to finally explode. What's particularly effective is how personal the conflict becomes. At this stage, nobody is fighting because of the Sokovia Accords anymore. The political debate has largely faded into the background. This is no longer about ideology. It's about pain. It's about betrayal. It's about loss. It's about truths that have remained buried for far too long. And because those emotions are so deeply human, the confrontation immediately feels more intimate than anything that came before it. The powers almost become secondary. Of course, they're still important. These are superheroes. The action remains intense, but what you're really watching is emotional devastation expressed through physical conflict. Every punch means something. Every decision carries weight. Every moment feels loaded with history. That's why the sequence lands so effectively. The audience understands exactly what's being lost, not just in a practical sense, in an emotional sense. Friendships, trust, respect, the sense of unity that once held these characters together. All of it is being damaged in real time. And unlike many blockbuster finales, the movie doesn't offer an easy escape from those consequences. There's no magical reset button, no last-minute speech that fixes everything. No sudden realization that instantly repairs the damage. The wounds remain. That's important, because it makes the conflict feel meaningful. The movie respects the seriousness of what has happened. It allows actions to have lasting effects. And because of that, the ending lingers. Long after the fight itself is over, long after the credits begin approaching, you're still thinking about what it all cost. That's ultimately why the final confrontation stands as the emotional centerpiece of Civil War. Not because it's the biggest battle, not because it's the most visually spectacular, but because it's the moment where every theme, every relationship, every regret, and every consequence finally collide. The airport battle may be the sequence people talk about first, but this is the scene that gives the movie its soul, and without it, Civil War wouldn't hit nearly as hard as it does. One thing that often gets overshadowed by the characters and the conflict in Civil War is just how polished the movie is from a technical standpoint. People usually leave talking about Team Cap versus Team Iron Man, the airport battle, Spider-Man's introduction, or the emotional ending. Those conversations tend to dominate everything else, but underneath all of that, there's a lot of technical craftsmanship quietly holding the movie together, and honestly, it deserves some attention. The first thing that stands out is the visual style. What's interesting is that Civil War feels much closer to The Winter Soldier than it does to some of Marvel's more colorful or fantastical films. There's a slightly grounded quality to the way it's shot. Not realistic in a literal sense, obviously. This is still a movie about superheroes, but grounded in presentation. The Russo brothers continue using a visual approach that often emphasizes movement, physicality, and immediacy rather than constantly chasing flashy imagery. That decision works well for the story being told. Because despite the enormous cast and larger-than-life powers, Civil War is ultimately a very personal movie. The visual language reflects that. The camera often stays surprisingly close to the characters during important moments. Reactions matter, expressions matter, small emotional details matter. The movie understands that people need to feel the conflict, not just watch it. Cinematography plays a big role in that. Many of the locations have a distinct identity without feeling exaggerated. Whether the story moves through crowded cities, government facilities, private conversations, or large action environments, the film generally maintains a clean and consistent visual identity. Nothing feels dramatically out of place. Everything belongs to the same world. That's harder to achieve than it sounds, especially in a movie that jumps between so many characters and locations. Then there's the editing. For the most part, the film is edited with impressive confidence. Scenes move quickly. Information is delivered efficiently. The narrative rarely feels stagnant. Given the amount of material the movie needs to cover, that's a significant accomplishment. There are occasional moments where the editing becomes slightly hectic during larger action sequences, but generally speaking, the movie remains easy to follow. That's important. Spectacle loses its impact if audiences can't understand what's happening. Fortunately, Civil War usually avoids that trap. The action remains readable. The geography remains understandable. The momentum remains strong. Sound design is another area where the film quietly excels. This isn't the kind of technical element most viewers consciously think about while watching, but they definitely feel it. Impacts feel heavier because of the sound design. Action scenes feel larger because of the sound design. Moments of tension become more effective because of the sound design. The movie understands how to use audio to create weight, and that weight matters. Especially when the story depends on audiences believing that actions have consequences. The musical score deserves recognition as well. It's not necessarily the most talked-about score in the MCU, but it consistently supports the film's emotional tone. When the movie needs excitement, the music delivers energy. When the story shifts toward tension, loss, or uncertainty, the score adjusts accordingly. It never feels like it's competing with the story for attention. Instead, it strengthens the atmosphere already being created. That's usually the mark of an effective soundtrack. What's particularly impressive is how all these technical elements work together. Nothing feels isolated. The cinematography supports the performances. The editing supports the pacing. The sound design supports the action. The music supports the emotion. Each department seems focused on the same goal, making the story feel immediate, making the conflict feel real, making the audience care. Of course, there are occasional technical imperfections. A few action scenes become slightly messy. Certain visual effects shots are stronger than others. Not every creative choice works equally well, but overall, the craftsmanship remains consistently high, and that's really the key point. Civil War isn't a movie relying solely on its characters or franchise popularity. The technical foundation is strong enough to support everything else. That's part of the reason the film continues to hold up. Years later, the emotional moments still work, the action still works, the pacing still works. And a lot of that comes down to the quality of the filmmaking itself, because when all the technical pieces are functioning together, audiences stop noticing the individual parts. They simply become immersed in the experience. And Civil War achieves that more often than not. Now, whenever you're talking about a modern Marvel movie, sooner or later, the conversation is going to turn toward CGI. It's unavoidable. These films are built around characters who can fly, shrink, run at impossible speeds, fire energy beams, and survive situations that would instantly destroy normal human beings. Without visual effects, a movie like Civil War simply doesn't exist. The question isn't whether CGI is used. The question is how well it's used. And honestly, Civil War is an interesting case because opinions on this tend to be surprisingly divided. Some viewers look at the film and see a technical showcase. Others look at it and feel like certain moments become a little too dependent on digital effects. I can understand both perspectives. Let's start with what's working. At its best, the visual effects are incredibly effective at expanding the scale of the movie. The film is constantly dealing with situations that would be impossible to create practically. Characters are performing superhuman actions. Massive environments are being transformed into battlefields. Technologies that don't exist are interacting with powers that couldn't exist, and most of the time the audience accepts it. That's actually a bigger compliment than it sounds. Good visual effects aren't necessarily the ones that make you say, "Wow, look at that CGI." They're the ones you stop thinking about entirely. There are numerous moments throughout Civil War where the effects simply become part of the world. You aren't analyzing them, you're following the story. That's usually a sign that the illusion is working. The airport battle is probably the clearest example. A sequence like that could not function without extensive digital work. The number of powers, abilities, environmental interactions, and large-scale visual moments would be impossible to achieve otherwise. Yet most audiences don't leave discussing the computer-generated imagery. They leave discussing the characters. That's important. The effects support the scene rather than becoming the scene. The same applies to characters like Vision and Ant-Man. Their abilities require extensive visual manipulation, but the movie generally integrates those effects smoothly into the action. You accept what you're seeing because the film commits to its own internal reality. That's a huge part of successful CGI, consistency. However, this is also where some criticisms begin to emerge. There are definitely moments where the digital elements become more noticeable. A few action scenes feel less grounded than others. Certain shots carry that familiar blockbuster sensation where you become aware that actors and environments are being combined digitally rather than existing in the same physical space. It's not constant, but it's there. And depending on your tolerance for modern blockbuster visuals, those moments may stand out more or less. Some viewers have argued that a handful of sequences lose a bit of impact because of this. When action becomes too obviously digital, physical danger can sometimes feel reduced. The audience intellectually understands what's happening, but emotionally feels slightly disconnected from it. That's a challenge many superhero films face, not just Civil War. The entire genre wrestles with it. What's interesting is that Civil War often works best when it combines visual effects with strong character motivation. The more emotionally invested you become, the less you're analyzing whether a particular shot was created practically or digitally. You're focused on the people involved, the conflict, the consequences. That's where the movie gains an advantage. Because so much of its action is tied to character relationships, the visual effects rarely have to carry scenes entirely on their own. They're supporting emotional storytelling rather than replacing it. And that's usually when CGI is at its strongest, not when it's demanding attention, when it's helping tell the story. Ultimately, I think Civil War falls into a category that many of the better MCU films occupy. The visual effects are impressive enough to create the world the story requires, but the movie's success doesn't depend entirely on them. If audiences remember the airport battle, it's not because of pixels, it's because of the people involved. If audiences remember the final confrontation, it's not because of computer-generated imagery, it's because of the emotion underneath it. The effects make those moments possible. The storytelling makes them memorable. And that's probably the healthiest relationship a blockbuster can have with CGI. Use it as a tool, not as the entire attraction. For the most part, Civil War understands that distinction very well. At nearly 2.5 hours long, Captain America: Civil War is the kind of movie that probably shouldn't move as quickly as it does. On paper, the runtime sounds intimidating. A massive ensemble cast, multiple storylines, political debates, character drama, new hero introductions, several major action sequences, a plot that connects to years of previous MCU storytelling. That's a lot to fit into one movie. And yet, for most of its runtime, Civil War rarely feels like it's dragging its feet. That's one of the more impressive things about it. The film understands that pacing isn't simply about moving fast. It's about constantly giving the audience something meaningful to engage with. A slower scene isn't automatically a pacing problem if it's developing a character, strengthening a relationship, or advancing the conflict. Likewise, a fast action scene isn't automatically exciting if nothing important is happening underneath it. Civil War generally finds a healthy balance between those two extremes. Whenever the movie slows down, it's usually because it's building toward something. A conversation matters, an argument matters, a revelation matters. The quieter scenes aren't just pauses between action sequences. They're often laying the emotional groundwork for what comes later. That makes the film feel purposeful. You rarely get the impression that scenes are included simply to fill runtime. Even when characters are sitting around talking, those conversations tend to be moving the story forward in some way. Of course, that doesn't mean the pacing is perfect. There are definitely moments where you can feel the strain of the movie's ambitions. With so many characters and storylines competing for attention, certain sections move faster than others. A few plot threads could probably benefit from additional development, while others occasionally feel like they're rushing to reach the next major event. That's the trade-off of a film this crowded. Something is always competing for screen time. Still, I'd argue that the movie's momentum remains remarkably strong considering how much material it's trying to cover. Part of that comes from the structure. The film rarely spends too long in one place. Just when a political discussion begins to settle in, the story shifts toward a personal conflict. Just when the emotional tension starts building, the narrative introduces a new complication. Just when things begin feeling heavy, the movie finds a moment of humor or action to reset the rhythm. That constant variation helps keep the audience engaged. The runtime becomes less noticeable because the movie keeps changing gears. What's interesting is how differently people seem to react to the length. Some viewers feel the 147 minutes fly by. Others think the movie could have been trimmed slightly. And honestly, both reactions make sense. If you're invested in the characters and already familiar with the MCU, there's a good chance the runtime feels justified. The story is giving you enough emotional and narrative material to stay engaged. If you're less invested in the larger universe, however, the length may feel more noticeable, which brings us to accessibility. This is probably one of the few areas where Civil War asks a lot from its audience. Technically, you can watch the movie without seeing every previous Marvel film. You'll understand the basic conflict. You'll understand who the major players are. You'll understand the central debate. But there's a difference between understanding something and feeling it. A lot of the movie's emotional impact comes from history. Relationships that have been developing for years, events that happened in previous films, trust that was built over multiple stories. The film assumes a certain level of familiarity with these characters, not constantly. Not in a way that becomes impossible for newcomers, but enough that longtime viewers are rewarded. And honestly, that's both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because the movie doesn't waste time reintroducing characters audiences already know. It's a weakness because some emotional moments won't carry the same weight for people entering the story for the first time. That said, Civil War does a surprisingly good job helping audiences keep up. The central conflict is clear. The motivations are understandable. The stakes are easy to follow. Even if some of the deeper emotional layers work better for dedicated MCU fans, the core narrative remains accessible. By the end, I think the pacing succeeds largely because the movie never forgets what's driving the story. Not the action, not the spectacle, the characters. As long as the audience remains invested in them, the runtime becomes much easier to accept. And for most of its 2.5-hour journey, Civil War earns that investment. That's why the movie rarely feels as long as it actually is. There's simply too much happening, and too much that matters, for the audience to spend much time checking the clock. It's almost impossible to talk about Captain America, Civil War without comparing it to other superhero movies, partly because that's what audiences naturally do, but also because Civil War arrived at a really interesting moment in the genre. By 2016, superhero films weren't just popular anymore, they were dominating the industry. Studios were building cinematic universes, launching interconnected franchises, and competing to create bigger and bigger events. So when Civil War landed, it wasn't being judged in isolation. It was being measured against everything else around it. And honestly, that's where the movie becomes even more interesting. The most obvious comparison is Batman v Superman. The timing alone guaranteed it. Both films were released in the same year. Both centered around heroes fighting each other. Both explored questions about accountability and public trust. Both asked whether powerful individuals should be allowed to operate without oversight. On the surface, they sound surprisingly similar, but once you actually watch them, the differences become much clearer. What gives Civil War an advantage is the groundwork. The conflict doesn't emerge from nowhere. It grows out of years of established relationships, previous events, and accumulated history. The audience already understands who these characters are. They understand why these friendships matter. They understand what could be lost if those relationships collapse. As a result, the confrontation feels earned. That's probably the word I keep coming back to. Earned. The movie spends a lot of time building emotional credibility before asking the audience to accept a conflict of this magnitude. Whether someone prefers one film over the other is entirely subjective, of course. But Civil War generally benefits from the fact that it feels like the natural continuation of existing character arcs rather than a conflict created solely for spectacle. Another interesting comparison is X-Men: The Last Stand, not because the movies are identical, but because both explore versions of a similar idea: questions of regulation, questions of control, questions about how society should respond to extraordinary individuals. Both films involve characters taking different sides of a larger ideological debate. The difference is that Civil War generally feels more focused on the personal consequences of those divisions. The political ideas matter, but the relationships matter even more. That's where much of the emotional impact comes from. Then there are comparisons within the MCU itself. And honestly, that's where things get really competitive, because Civil War isn't just trying to stand alongside other superhero films. It's competing with some of Marvel's strongest entries: The Winter Soldier, The Avengers, Iron Man, Guardians of the Galaxy. Several films in the MCU had already established a high standard by this point. What's impressive is that Civil War comfortably belongs in those conversations, not because it's necessarily better than all of them. People will debate that forever, but because it succeeds in a way that's uniquely its own. The Winter Soldier thrives as a political thriller. The Avengers thrives as a team-up spectacle. Civil War somehow sits between those two ideas. It combines the political tension of one with the ensemble scale of the other. That's a difficult balance to achieve, and it's one of the reasons the film remains so highly regarded. There's also the broader superhero genre to consider. A lot of hero versus hero stories struggle because they eventually run out of reasons for the conflict to continue. The audience starts asking obvious questions. Why don't they just talk? Why don't they explain the situation? Why is this misunderstanding lasting so long? Civil War mostly avoids those problems. The disagreement isn't based on confusion. It's based on genuine ideological differences. The characters understand each other. They simply don't agree. That distinction makes the conflict much stronger than many similar stories. What's fascinating is that the movie also arrives during a period when superhero fatigue was already becoming a discussion. People were beginning to wonder whether audiences would eventually grow tired of these films, whether the formula would become repetitive, whether the genre could continue evolving. In some ways, Civil War feels like Marvel's answer to those concerns. Instead of simply making the action bigger, it makes the conflict more personal. Instead of introducing another world-ending threat, it focuses on relationships. Instead of asking how heroes save the world, it asks what happens when heroes stop trusting each other. That's a meaningful shift. And it's one of the reasons the film stands out. Years later, when conversations turn toward the strongest superhero films of the modern era, Civil War consistently finds its way into the discussion, not because it's flawless, not because everyone agrees on every aspect of it, but because it successfully combines spectacle, character, theme, and emotion in a way that many superhero movies aspire to and relatively few actually achieve. That's why the comparisons continue, and honestly, that's probably a compliment. Looking back now, years after its release, what's most impressive about Captain America: Civil War isn't necessarily any single scene. It's not just the airport battle. It's not just Spider-Man's debut. It's not just Black Panther's introduction. It's not even the final confrontation. It's the fact that the movie mattered, and I mean that in the truest sense of the word. A lot of blockbuster films promise huge consequences. Marketing campaigns tell us everything will change. Characters talk about events that will supposedly reshape their worlds forever. Then the credits roll, and a movie later, everything is basically back to normal. Civil War doesn't really do that. The damage sticks. The relationships change. The trust that once held the Avengers together doesn't magically reappear. By the end of the movie, the team we've spent years watching is fractured in a way that feels genuine. And that's probably the film's biggest achievement. It convinces you that its events matter beyond the runtime. What's interesting is that the movie never relies on a traditional world-ending threat to create importance. No alien invasion is hanging over the story. No giant portal is swallowing cities. No unstoppable force is threatening all life on Earth. The stakes are smaller, but somehow they feel larger, because they're personal. The movie understands that audiences often care more about people than spectacle, more about relationships than destruction, more about emotional consequences than physical ones. That's exactly where Civil War finds its strength. The Avengers don't fall apart because a villain overpowers them. They fall apart because they stop believing in each other. And honestly, that's a much more painful thing to watch. It's also what gives the film such a unique place within the MCU. When people discuss the most important entries in the franchise, Civil War almost always comes up, not just because it's entertaining, because it's a turning point. A lot of what follows in later MCU stories feels connected to decisions made here. The movie becomes a bridge between one era of the franchise and another, and because of that, its influence extends far beyond its own narrative. But even if we completely ignore the larger MCU implications, the film still works remarkably well on its own terms. The story is ambitious, sometimes maybe a little too ambitious. The cast is enormous. The themes are surprisingly thoughtful, the action is consistently strong, the performances are excellent.